In the city of Eolog, Korea, the global gaming company Elog Korea selected true professionals in the online field for their revolutionary work. Shinn was chosen for the beta test of the game, which made him extremely happy, and he eagerly awaited the start. When Shinn sat down at a special device for virtual movement, the system announced that the user had been confirmed and the restoration had been launched. After moving into the game, Shin wondered if the simulation that was so similar to reality was real, or if it was all a lie. Realizing that the game had started, Shin understood that this was the beginning, and that it was called a game, even though the world was no different from real life. Then, not far from Shin, an enemy army began to attack them with bows and arrows. When an arrow grazed Shin, he was very surprised, and his body in the camera began to tremble strangely. Then Shin realized that he was in a lot of pain, and that he could feel it even though it was all a game. One of the employees announced that Shin's game time was 6 minutes and 33 seconds. With a smile, the director asked about the subject's assimilation level. The employee replied that it was 100% and that he was sure that the last test subject was experiencing fatal pain. With a smile, the director told the employees not to relax and ordered them to give the test subjects a taste of the real simulator called Hell. In the game, holding his head, Shin told himself that this made no sense and wondered how it was even possible. Suddenly, the gray-haired man grabbed Shinn and began shouting, asking how long General Shinn was going to behave like this and why he hadn't given a single order in such a situation. Looking at the gray-haired man in surprise, Shin did not understand what orders he was talking about, but then he remembered the ESC button on the keyboard. With a new idea, Shin realized what command to give and told the gray-haired man, begging him to let him leave because he didn't want to be in this game anymore. Then one of the enemies said that it was getting boring and mentioned his old friendship with General Shin's father. The enemy announced that he was going to Shin. Raising dust around him, the enemy began to gather his strength and, destroying everything in his path, headed for the fortress where Shinn was. Raising his axe against the moon, the enemy addressed Shin and announced that he had finally caught up with him, calling him the general's son. Not understanding what the enemy was saying, Shinn began to scream in horror, asking what the enemy was talking about and begging him to stop. Then Shinn began to understand that this was the beginning of endless rebirths. Talking to himself, Shinn said that in the end, the only thing he could do in this hell was to fight to the end to survive. Then the girl opposite him said that if Shinn fought, he would feel intense pain unlike anything he had ever felt before in his life. Holding her sword out towards Shinn, the girl asked him confidently if he still wanted to fight. Looking at the girl with a serious expression, Shinn thought that no matter how many times he had to fight, he would survive no matter what. Gathering all his strength and taking his sword, Shinn thought that he was ready to fight until he finished this fierce battle with his own hands. Looking at the fortress, Shinn realized that even destruction could not defeat the endless cycle of rebirth. And so, the battle of the young man Shin began right then and there. Near the school, all the students began to rejoice at the winter holidays, and only Shin looked at everyone from the sidelines alone. Annoyed, Shin looked around and wondered why everyone was so cheerful, because in any case, the test trap was clearly waiting for them more than school. Exhaling, Shinn told himself that if he had exams next year, the test questions would be much more difficult, and for him, who had only just begun to live in this world, it seemed terribly boring. Suddenly, Shinn's phone rang, and when he was about to ask who it was, the call was interrupted, and a man announced that it was a delivery and wanted to know if Shinn was home. Shinn wanted to ask him to leave the delivery at the door, but the man said he had to deliver the package in person. Surprised, Shinn tried to remember if he had ordered anything, but told the man he would be right there and to wait. Approaching the house, Shinn saw the courier holding a small package and waiting for him. Seeing the logo on the package, Shinn quickly ran to the courier. The man wanted to see Shinn's student ID, and Shinn quickly showed it to him, took the package, and ran home. The courier was very surprised by this behavior and said to himself that his son, who was studying at a training school, and Shinn both went crazy when they saw the logo of a gaming company. But Shinn didn't care what the courier thought because he ran home quickly to see what was in the package. Looking inside the package, Shinn saw a special device called VR equipment. Following the instructions, Shinn put on the VR equipment, preparing to see what it could do. When he pressed the start button, Shinn heard a message from the system saying that it was analyzing the user's biological data and asking Shinn not to move. After the analysis, the system thanked Shinn and congratulated him on his VIP beta tester status. Unexpectedly, a girl who looked like a real girl appeared to Shinn's right, looking at him in surprise. The sudden appearance of the girl surprised and frightened Shinn because he did not understand who she was and began to wave his arms in fear. Walking across the room, the girl said that if this surprised Shinn, she was disappointed in him because as soon as she snapped her fingers, Shinn's room changed into different areas as if it were real. After demonstrating her abilities, the girl announced to Shinn that she was introducing him to an unforgettable game called Ilu, and the girl forgot to give Shinn the invitation. Throwing the piece of paper to the boy, the girl smiled. Shinn caught the piece of paper, opened it, and saw a three-dimensional model of the game company's buildings. Shinn couldn't believe his eyes that it was all real. That evening, during the family dinner, Shinn told his parents that he had become a private beta tester for a new game from a cool company, chosen from among many candidates. Uninterested in the conversation, his father asked if Shinn wanted to be a tester or tennis player and asked how long it would take. Awkwardly, Shinn said that it would be 15 days and 14 nights during winter break and that he would be paid by the hour. But when Shinn wanted to continue, his father refused. An uncomfortable silence hung over the table because Shinn had not even been listened to and had already been refused. And when Shinn wanted to argue, his father angrily put down his spoon. With an angry shout, his father said that even though Shinn was already a third-year high school student who had gone through psychological training for the Marines, he asked what Shinn had achieved, because his father did not consider games to be an achievement. With tears in his eyes, Shinn hoped for his mother's support, but she just turned away. His father continued to shout, saying how many times he had told Shinn that studying was hard work. Shinn angrily slammed his fist on the table, stood up, and said that he understood, and that if he couldn't go, he wouldn't go, which surprised his parents. His father wanted to continue the conversation and yelled that Shinn hadn't finished his meal and asked where he was going, continuing to say that nutrition was very important at his age. But now his mother grabbed his father by the jacket to stop him from yelling and yelled at him to calm down. But thinking that this was his only chance, Shinn was determined not to give it up, and knew that he would definitely take the beta test and already had a plan. On the first day of the test, Shinn left the house and told his parents that he was going to the academy, but he had other plans. Already on the subway, Shinn called his teacher and told him that he was going on a 15-day trip with his family. When his teacher asked where they were going, Shinn replied that they were going to Quebec, Canada. This surprised his teacher because they were going to an even colder place than where they were now. But despite his teacher's doubts, Shinn was confident that the problem with the academy had been resolved, but he needed to prepare for the day when his parents would call. But that was a matter for the future. Upon arriving at the gaming company, Shinn realized that this was the most important place for him right now. Looking at the entrance, Shinn thought that games were what saved him from his boring routine. An employee approached Shinn and was about to say something, but Shinn didn't pay any attention. Raising his hand, Shinn showed his bracelet with his invitation from the virtual kingdom. He put his hand on the door, and they let him into the building. Once inside, Shinn saw many different monsters and people walking around in virtual reality helmets. Shinn thought it was very cool. Suddenly, right in front of Shinn, an enemy from a game he had recently played appeared. The enemy bug swung and tried to strike Shinn, but he dodged the attack in time. Frightened, Shinn began to run away and wonder what was happening and what this was all about. Running away from the evil bug, Shinn shouted loudly, begging him to leave him alone. And when Bug was about to strike Shinn again, a girl came out and ordered Bug to stop immediately. Confidently, the girl said that although Bag looked scary, he was a low-level opponent, so Shinn should not be afraid of him. The girl jumped on Bag and knocked him down with one hand. Breathing a sigh of relief, Shinn was happy to see the female camerawoman again. The girl agreed with him and smiled at Shinn. But something seemed strange to Shinn, and he asked the girl why her voice sounded like that. Leaning toward Shinn, the girl asked what was wrong with her voice. Suddenly, the girl disappeared and was replaced by a gray-haired, smiling man who asked if his voice sounded too masculine. The man apologized to Shinn and said that it was time to stop joking, but in his opinion, Shinn had reacted very funny from the moment he entered. Hearing that it was a joke, Shinn began to get up, and the people around him also began to laugh. Shinn thought that the man was to blame and felt very embarrassed, but Shinn still thought it was incredibly cool, just as he had expected from a gaming company. Turning to Lee Yu-shin, the man introduced himself as Lee Hyung-gyu, the CEO of testing. Tai Hyung-gyu said that his greeting was delayed because Shinn himself was late. Awkwardly, Shinn apologized to director Hyung-gyu and began to think that he might be fired for being late, which would be the worst-case scenario for him. Hyung-gyu said that Shinn didn't need to apologize and that it was time to move on to the planned tour. Pointing to the elevator, Hyung-kyu invited Shinn and emphasized that they didn't have much time, so he thought they should go to the office and give the presentation after the test. Entering the elevator, Hyung-gyu asked Shinn if he would mind starting earlier because of his tardiness. Shinn happily agreed, saying that was fine, so they would go straight to the exam room. Meanwhile, an unknown man was watching Hyung-gyu and Shinn through a camera in the elevator and on a TV in the room, talking on the phone and saying that he was confident and trusted only the client. On the phone, the man asked someone to come and take a look. It was the branch manager, Bernadotte. When he hung up, he said to himself that now he hoped to sell the product properly. Picking up the remote control, the manager zoomed in on Shinn and said, as if addressing him, that he was very sorry, but it was just business. When Hyung-gyu and Shinn arrived at the right door, the system announced that A12 had been opened. While Shinn was looking around, Hyung-gyu pointed to a suit standing nearby and told him that after Shinn changed into the suit, he should go to the main hall, and Hyung-gyu would return as soon as he checked the final preparations. After changing, Shinn began waving his arms and shouting about how cool he looked in the suit. When Shinn arrived at the main hall, he was unexpectedly blinded by a bright flash of light. When the light disappeared, Shinn looked ahead and saw a beautiful white-haired girl in front of him. Approaching the girl, Shinn began to talk to her, saying that it was just like last time, and told director Lee Hyun-kyu that this version of the operator was better than the last one. This began to annoy the girl, but Shinn especially noticed the smell of shampoo and didn't understand how it was possible to convey that. Awkwardly, Lee Hyun-kyu said that it was probably because Miss Maria had just washed her hair. Shinn was surprised, and Maria told him to stop making such a strange face. Maria threatened Shinn maliciously and asked if he wanted his nose to get hurt. Frightened by Maria's words, Shinn said he was very sorry and apologized, but didn't notice that he had bumped into something behind him. It was a virtual reality machine, and when Shinn sat down, the system announced that the user had been confirmed and the restoration had started. Meanwhile, Maria turned to Director Lee and asked what was wrong with Shinn, calling him an idiot and wondering why he was behaving that way. Director Lee told Maria that he was very sorry, but due to problems with their server, they had no choice but to merge the online and simulation servers. Maria angrily shouted how this could be online and if they had lost their minds, since Shinn was a regular user. Sitting in the virtual machine, Shinn didn't like Maria's words, but he couldn't argue with her. Ignoring Shinn, Maria said in a serious tone that if management found out that they had let a regular user into the training simulator, they would be in big trouble. Then Director Lee said he was sorry, but because of the last incident, they had to do it this way. Otherwise, the simulator wouldn't work at all. Shinn was worried that they should have already started and wondered why they were wasting time. Maria nervously said that she couldn't believe she had to do this with him and that she didn't agree. Then Director Lee announced that he understood, so Maria would have access to the training simulator starting today. This surprised Sheena, and Director Lee asked Maria how they could cancel everything. Putting on her helmet, Maria said that it was an accident and that Director Lee shouldn't try to cover it up, because she would make sure he was punished. With a smile, Director Lee thanked Maria for her generosity and emphasized that they would need to work out the details of the game as they went along. Taking a deep breath, Director Lee told Shinn and Maria to get ready to start. Awkwardly, Shinn put on his helmet and began to prepare to immerse himself in virtual reality. Director Lee announced to all employees that the server was being launched. The employees began generating the landscape and checking the level of assimilation in the game. Suddenly, Shinn felt a strange sensation and did not understand why it had suddenly become so hot in the chamber. But Director Lee announced that there was no need to worry because the energy exchange between the program and the body would soon disappear. When the employees announced that assimilation had reached 100%, everything was ready and the countdown began. Then the system announced that the simulator was activated, and Director Lee wished everyone an enjoyable adventure and a good time. While the system was loading, Shinn thought about what he was hearing and where the strange feeling of familiarity was coming from. When Shinn woke up, he realized that the familiar feeling was from the pouring cold rain that was falling on him. Looking around, Shinn nervously wondered why he was lying in a capsule and why he was so cold. Looking at himself, Shinn realized that he was wearing armor and a cloak, and that this place looked like a game. Suddenly, a soldier in a nearby tower shouted to the general that an enemy army had reached the plain nearby. This surprised Shinn because he thought that his training in the game was supposed to begin. Behind Shinn appeared a worried gray-haired man who addressed him as General. The man told Shinn that if they continued to just survive, it would cause unrest among the troops and asked Shinn to hurry up and give orders. Not understanding anything, Shinn wondered why he was a general and what orders he was supposed to give. Looking around at the army, Shinn saw many soldiers looking at him and waiting for orders. Then Shinn realized that his armor was not ordinary and was intended for a commander. But looking around, Shinn saw that they were surrounded by the sea and asked where the plains were. The gray-haired man replied that even God would want it to be only black sea waters. Lost in thought, Shinn began to wonder why it was not the sea, and looking closer, he saw that it was a huge army moving toward them. Turning to the man, Shinn panicked and asked how there could be so many of them. Starting to shout, the gray-haired man said that even if the situation was hopeless, he begged Shinn to quickly give them orders and lead the army. The gray-haired man's reaction frightened Shinn so much that he even jumped aside. Turning to the man in fear, Shinn said that he was already scared and wondered why he was yelling at a non-player character. Waving his arms and looking around, Shinn began to search for the control panel in the interface window. Then the man in the tower shouted again that the enemy army was preparing to attack. When the gray-haired man yelled at Shinn again, he replied that he didn't have a game manual and didn't know what to do. Turning around, the gray-haired man said angrily that he couldn't just sit there and let the enemy attack first. And on his own, he ordered the army to get ready for battle and the archers to prepare. Shouting at the top of his voice, the gray-haired man said that the army must fight with all their might. In response, the army shouted to the gray-haired man that they were ready for battle. Then the soldiers of Shinna and the enemy army began to attack each other in order to destroy their enemies. When the enemy army fired their arrows, the gray-haired man told the knights to raise their shields. Thanks to this, many soldiers were able to withstand the arrow fire, but not all were so lucky. While Shinn's army was distracted, the enemy army climbed the tower using ladders for close combat, but Sheena's army was prepared for this. So they began throwing stones from the tower to delay the enemy army. Watching the army's actions, the gray-haired man told the army not to let the enemies climb up and that they must be stopped. Watching everything that was happening, Shinn began to worry and wonder if this was really just a game. Because if it wasn't real, then it was very similar to reality, and Shinn wondered if this game was online. But at that moment, an arrow flew past Shinn, and in horror, Shinn began to scream because he felt pain in the game, but he couldn't even tell if it was real pain. Seeing what had happened to Shinn, the gray-haired man shouted to the soldiers to immediately begin protecting the general. When the next rain of arrows came, this time the knights raised their shields over Shinn to protect him. Meanwhile, Shinn could only tell himself that this must be some kind of mistake, because he couldn't even find the control window. In horror, Shinn wondered if he was really stuck in this place. A red-haired boy appeared nearby and asked why all the knights had frozen because the enemy archers had stopped firing and it was time for them to return to their positions. When Shinn was left alone, a gray-haired man approached him, grabbed his cloak, and asked how long Shinn was going to behave like this, and why he hadn't given a single order in such a situation. Hearing about the orders, Shinn remembered the ESC button and came up with an idea. With tears in his eyes and frightened, Shinn gave the order to the gray-haired man, begging for permission to leave because he did not want to stay in this game for another minute. Shaking Shinn, the gray-haired man aggressively began to shout and ask what Shinn was talking about. At that moment, a large man appeared in the distance, bored by the fight and thinking about his old friendship with Shinn's father, Li Yu. He didn't want to stay, so the man announced that he was leaving. Suddenly, the man gathered all his strength and rushed toward the tower, attracting the attention of all Shinn's soldiers and his colleagues. The gray-haired man and Shinn could not believe their eyes when they saw the whirlwind destroy their army in the tower. But the evil man could no longer be stopped, and the bright glow compelled him to fight his enemies. The silhouette seemed familiar to Shinn because he had met this enemy before. Looking at the enemy in full height, Shinn realized that it was Black Vin, the hero from the game he had seen before. Seeing Black Vin, the soldiers called him a monster and began to flee, although the gray-haired man tried to stop them and shouted for them to stay where they were, because if they fled, they would be destroyed. But before the soldiers could escape, Black Vin raised his axe to deliver the fatal blow. Black Vin asked maliciously if the knights thought they could escape their fate because they had prepared for it. And then General Shinn was left alone, for there was not a single soldier left in his army. Black Vin asked Shinn with interest what he was doing and if he was still going to hide behind his knights. Shinn looked at Black Vin in horror when Black Vin said that his father was weaker than him. But Black Vin remembered how hot-headed Shinn's father had been, so he destroyed him, and in his opinion, it was pitiful. Then Black Vin took out a sword, which Shinn saw, and Shinn wondered if he would be able to leave the game if he was killed in it. Then Black Vin asked Shinn why he didn't take the sword and start fighting. Surprised, Shinn raised his head and wondered why he hadn't been destroyed yet. In front of Shinn, between his legs, stood the sword that Black Vin had placed there, which he recognized and called a half-breed. And then Black Vin said that killing a child without a weapon would be a disgrace to him. After Black Vin's words, Shinn looked at him maliciously and thought that something was wrong with Black Vin, and loudly asked him who he was. Grabbing his sword, Shinn began to rise and asked Black Vin maliciously what he knew about his father, and how he dared to speak for him. Shouting, Shinn said that if Black Vin was an enemy in this game, why didn't he just destroy him? And that people like him knew about his father. Raising his sword menacingly and preparing for battle, Shinn told Black Vin to shut his mouth. In his mind, Shinn wondered what this anger inside him was and why he wasn't scared since he had arrived here. Standing opposite Black Vin, Shinn thought that the man in front of him had destroyed their camp with just a few attacks, so he must be a monster. With a smile, Black Vin said that this was exactly how Shinn should behave, and that his facial expression added flavor. Black Vin grabbed his axe as a weapon and prepared to attack Shinn with a malicious smile. Seeing Black Vin's attack, Shinn realized what was about to happen, and shouted that if it had come to this, then he would fight Black Vin. But when Shinn raised his sword unexpectedly for him, the sword flew out of his hands, and Shinn wondered if the sword had always been so heavy. Approaching Shinn, Black Vin told him that he was no different from a clown. Meanwhile, Director Lee, who was watching Shinn's condition, announced with a smile that it was all over. Watching Shinn through the screen, Director Lee and his staff saw how he was destroyed, and everything that happened. One of the staff announced that Shinn's game time was 6 minutes and 33 seconds, and Director Lee asked what the assimilation level was. The employee replied that it was 100%. With a smile, Director Lee said that Shinn's transformation was possible today, so Lee Hyung-kyu told all employees to prepare and send the recording to the manager. He also ordered the system to be rebooted and told everyone not to relax because the players needed to experience the real simulator they called Hell. Meanwhile, Shinn heard his mother calling him to dinner because she had prepared his favorite dish, tteokbokki, and she asked him not to tell her that he was going to the academy without even trying. Shinn's father was sitting nearby and asked if Shinn had been playing all night. His mother told his father not to grumble at the table before dinner, and his father announced that he wasn't grumbling. Standing in front of them, Shinn couldn't believe his eyes and wondered if he had really returned to the real world. Sitting down at the chair where he always ate, Shinn leaned forward to smell the childhood aroma of his favorite dish. Laughing, Shinn said that it really was his mother's twenjan jjigae. Ironically, his father asked Shinn if he should eat everything because it was very boring. His mother looked at him angrily and told him to calm down. With relief, Shinn wanted to start eating, thinking that he had returned to his everyday life. But suddenly water began to pour from the ceiling. His mother began to panic, and his father began to think that they were being flooded. At that moment, Shinn raised his head and understood everything. He knew that they weren't being flooded because the ceiling had disappeared, and above them was the sky with rain falling from it. Shinn began to shout angrily, asking if it was true, if it was just an illusion or a dream, saying that it couldn't be. Suddenly, Shinn's parents disappeared, and Shinn stood in the tower in armor while his camp was being attacked by enemies and his soldiers were defending it. Striking the ground with his hands, Shinn thought that this was the hell he had fallen into. In despair, Shinn said that this was simply impossible and that he could not bear to stay in this world. Then one of the soldiers shouted to Shinn that something was happening above. Shinn looked up and saw a large pile of arrows flying toward him. At that moment, one of the soldiers ran out and broke the arrows in midair to protect Shinn, but some arrows hit the soldier, knocking his helmet off. To Shinn's surprise, it was a girl who turned to him to check on him and see if he was hurt. Against the backdrop of the moon, the girl stood with a huge sword and looked at Shinn. Surprised, Shinn asked the girl where she came from and wondered if they were the same age. Shinn asked the girl if she wanted to say anything, but Shinn changed his mind because it was more important that the monster Black Vin would soon be coming for them. Looking around, Shinn began to call for CEO Lee and begged him to listen to him and stop this game immediately. The gray-haired man turned to Shinn and shouted at him to calm down and give orders because his behavior was causing the soldiers to panic. Grabbing Shinn by the shoulder, the gray-haired man told him that he was the same man and asked if he would defeat Black Vin. The other soldiers began to support Shinn and the gray-haired man, raising their swords in preparation for battle. Shinn angrily ordered them to stop talking nonsense and asked if they really thought that an ordinary high school student could defeat a monster like Black Vin. Shinn announced that he was not their general and that he just wanted to leave this game. Shinn's words greatly surprised all the soldiers and the gray-haired man because they did not understand what was happening to Shinn. Suddenly, the same girl who had saved him from the arrows earlier approached Shinn and took him by the shoulder. The girl asked Shinn if he really thought everything that was happening was a game, and then she wanted to tell him that this was not a game, but reality. With a serious expression, the girl told Shinn that in order to survive, they must fight. Her words frightened Shinn because he remembered Black Vin's strength and did not want to face him. Meanwhile, branch manager Bernadotte was eating meat for dinner and told director Lee that their return to New York was only a matter of time, thanks to CEO Lee Han-kyu. While director Lee thanked the branch manager behind him, a broadcast of Shinn's survival in the game was playing. But the branch manager said that only Maria was left and the manager called her a cheeky noble girl. Remembering Maria in the capsule, director Lee said that they were currently waiting for Maria to fall asleep. But remembering Shinn, director Lee said that the simulation would end as soon as Lee Yu-shin lost the will to live. The branch manager asked what would happen if Maria woke up and whether it was possible to control them both at the same time. Director Lee replied that due to the malfunction of the simulator it was possible, but they must not allow this small possibility to ruin the ending. Putting down his glass, the branch manager thought about the small probability, giving an example. Picking up his knife, the branch manager said that with the high school student Shinn, there was a chance that he could defeat Black Vin. Meanwhile, on the screen, Black Vin reappeared in front of Shinn, handing him the sword again for the fight. Director Lee looked sternly, but told the branch manager that he understood. While on the broadcast, Shinn called the CEO for help. Shinn shouted angrily that he knew that CEO Lee Hyun-kyu could hear him and was watching, and ordered that if they couldn't get him out of the game, they should at least raise his game stats. Ignoring Shinn's request, Director Lee told the branch manager that the probability he was talking about was 0. Meanwhile, Shinn tried desperately to fight Black Vin, but once again he was unable to defeat him because Black Vin was stronger and constantly destroyed Shinn. With a smile, Director Lee asked the branch manager if he was aware that Black Vin was immortal. Meanwhile, Shinn found himself in Black Vin's hands, who defeated him and continued to destroy him. Director Lee said that even if his DNA chain broke down, the fact that Black Vin was a disaster would not change. Eating his meat, the branch manager agreed and announced that he was worrying for nothing and that it was time to finish their dinner. In his mind, Shinn wondered what was happening and how many times he had been rebooted, because no matter how many times he faced destruction, he remained himself. Recalling previous reboots after destruction, Shinn thought that the first time fear had overcome him, making him feel sick. Even on his knees, Shinn begged Black Vin not to destroy him, and in complete despair, Shinn wondered why this was happening to him and why they were doing this to him. Thinking about the past, Shinn realized that he had done terrible things and that it was pointless on his part, but he kept trying. But in his mind, Shinn understood that despite this, something was bothering him. With a laugh, Black Vin always said that Shinn's father wasn't so pathetic and that he was quick-tempered. But after his failed attempts, Shinn realized that he couldn't even escape Black Vin. And Shinn understood why all his attempts, which he had lost count of, had been fruitless and had always ended in failure. Remembering Black Vin's words when he told Shinn that he was disappointed in him and that his father was not like that, then Shinn was ready to shut Black Vin up because he didn't understand anything. Thinking about everything that was happening, Shinn realized that Black Vin was just a strong, non-player character. But suddenly Shinn remembered the girl's words when she told him that they had to fight to survive. But remembering her words that this was reality, Shinn asked her not to make fun of him. Remembering the past, Shinn thought that going to game clubs with his friends after school and having dinner with his family at the same table was his reality. Looking around at the destroyed army and soldiers, Shinn realized that everything was not at all as it had been. Remembering Black Vin and Director Lee, Shinn cursed them and was filled with hatred for them. But despite the difficulties, Shinn picked up his sword and tried to defeat Black Vin. Suddenly, during another battle with Black Vin, Shinn managed to land at least one blow on Black Vin. Black Vin pushed Shinn away and told him that when Shinn spoke of his father, he was more passionate. Shinn's sword broke, but as he got up, Shinn confirmed Black Vin's words, but now he understood something. With an evil smile, Shinn told Black Vin to listen to him and announced that he was no longer afraid of Black Vin. It didn't matter to Shinn how many times he lost to Black Vin. Shinn would not run away from Black Vin. Smiling and getting up, Shinn said that after many reboots, he was sure he could defeat Black Vin. But in his mind, Shinn knew that this was the last thing he had left. Black Vin delivered a decisive blow to Shinn, and Shinn knew that this was his only option from the moment he began to reboot endlessly. When Black Vin finished his blow to destroy Shinn, he disappeared and his 31st session began. When Shinn woke up, he realized that there was only one way to survive in this game, and if Shinn was not mistaken, it was to fight off his enemies, which he told the soldiers. Then the girl handed Shinn a sword, saying that Shinn would not be able to match Black Vin even if he fought back, and that she did not know how much it would hurt. Still holding the sword, the girl asked Shinn if he would fight to the end. After a while, the girl destroys the enemy arrows flying at her, and Shinn to protect him. The girl reminds Shinn of his words to fight, and therefore she is ready to accompany Shinn and protect him. As he got up, Shinn wondered why he had to pretend that he cared about a game character, but he told the girl that he would not go back on his word. But remembering Director Lee and all his reboots in the game and his request to let him out or get help, Shinn decided that he would never trust anyone again. Standing up confidently and picking up his sword, Shinn told the girl that, in the end, they had no choice but to fight. The soldiers heard this, and the gray-haired man shouted that the general had given the order, and the army must immediately prepare for battle. As the battle began, Shinn thought that he was fed up with this battlefield, but now he was getting used to it and would not allow it to destroy him. When the girl approached Shinn, she stepped in front of him and said that if the general so desired, she would carry out his orders and she could teach Shinn. Standing with her back to the enemies, the girl told Shinn that she would teach him the basic skills of hand-to-hand combat. Taking a fighting stance and raising her sword to strike the enemies, the girl said that even if Shinn reached his maximum potential, he would have to swing his sword until the very end. Continuing the fight, the girl continued to demonstrate her skills to Shinn and how she destroyed enemies in her path. Meanwhile, watching the girl, Shinn was amazed by her skills and realized that she was very strong. The gray-haired man loudly announced that there was no way back, so the knights had to fight to the last, risking their lives. And when the battle began, one of the enemies attacked Shinn, but thanks to his sword, he managed to block his attack. But when the opportunity arose to destroy the enemy, Shinn wondered why he was doubting his actions in this situation. Meanwhile, the girl told Shinn that he should not doubt himself during battle. Shinn resolutely decided that in order to survive, he must destroy his enemies, and if he did not destroy them, they would destroy him. And when Shinn managed to destroy the enemy, he wondered if it was really so difficult to destroy just one enemy. But he did not notice that the enemy had wounded him. Shinn wondered if he would be able to survive here. Behind Shinn, the girl told him that the last thing left was to never lose hope of returning home. At that moment, the girl was killed in front of Shinn, and this caused him to feel a surge of anger toward his enemies. Surprised, Shinn wondered how a non-game girl could talk about home when she was only created by director Lee Hyung-kyu. And finally, Shinn shouted at her, asking her if she even knew anything about home. Shinn shouted at her maliciously that she didn't even know why he was fighting his enemies here, and that she shouldn't act like she knew everything. At that moment, the girl mysteriously turned to Shinn and looked at him, making Shinn wonder what that strange look meant. But the girl didn't have time to say anything to Shinn before she was destroyed. Shinn began to worry about what the girl had wanted to tell him before she was destroyed, and out of malice, Shinn shouted. Raising his sword and stepping forward toward his enemies, Shinn decided that it was time to continue the battle. Remembering the girl's words, Shinn decided that he would swing his sword as long as he had strength, and he would do so until the end. Shinn resolutely decided that he must destroy at least one enemy, and there should not be many of them. But when Shinn could destroy at least one enemy, he would be one step closer to returning home. But Shinn was not strong or prepared enough, so he fell into the trap of his enemies, and he did not destroy even one enemy, but they destroyed him again. Then Shinn's 33rd simulation began, but Shinn was viciously ready for battle and shouted at his enemies to come closer. With each battle, Shinn destroyed more and more enemies. After many battles, Shinn became more and more accustomed to fighting, and even to the weight of the sword in his hand, and Shinn could no longer remember how many enemies he had destroyed, but he understood that his strength was increasing, and that this strength did not disappear after rebooting. This was very good for Shinn, but he wondered why he didn't feel any joy. He had a suspicion, but suddenly the female knight called him from behind, and then Shinn began to think that it was because of her. And when the female knight approached Shinn, she wanted to say something to him again, but at that moment, enemy arrows fell on her. Looking at her, Shinn realized that regardless of what happened, the outcome for the girl would be the same, and he was sure that the end would always be the same. And Shinn wondered why it was him. Gritting his teeth, Shinn said that, as expected, she was just an illusion created in this game world. But it bothered him, and Shinn didn't understand why. But Shinn continued his fight and counted all the enemies he had defeated on the battlefield during another session. In his mind, Shinn knew that all this time he had believed that Shinn was lucky if he managed to destroy so many enemies on his own without training and using chaotic movements. But now everything was different because Shinn's skills had grown and they did not disappear after his reboots, so he was getting used to fighting. Suddenly, Shinn even managed to catch an arrow flying towards him with his bare hands, stopping its movement, and with that same arrow, Shinn destroyed another soldier. As soon as Shinn's strength grew, some of the enemy knights begged for mercy when they encountered him in battle. Confident in his growing strength, Shinn stood his ground and, despite his injuries, remained alive and continued to fight for a chance to escape. Looking around, Shinn saw that he was the only one left standing among all the soldiers, and Shinn wondered where the gray-haired man who liked to shout so much had gone, and where the red-haired knight had disappeared to. Unfortunately, Shinn's allies had already been destroyed, and there was no one left to continue the fight, although Shinn even suspected them of treason, or suspected that his comrades had fled. Gritting his teeth, Shinn told himself that right now it didn't matter, because now he had a battle to fight in order to return home, and it was his own battle. Suddenly, an enemy soldier reminded him of the soldier's girlfriend who was nearby, and at that moment, Shinn realized that he had thought he was alone, but this girl was with him, and he still didn't understand what she was thinking. And when Shinn's 97th simulation began, he asked the girl why she was smiling so much and what had made her happy this time. Surprised, the girl asked Shinn what he meant when he talked about this incident. When the girl was injured, Shinn emphasized that she was about to be destroyed, and Shinn explained that the girl always smiled before she was destroyed. Starting to scream, Shinn asked why the girl did this every time before the reboot, and why she didn't just run away instead of protecting him, and demanded an answer from her. Shinn was convinced that the girl was just an illusion in the game he was in, and that she was only pretending to be his friend. Shinn wondered if the girl really wanted him to worry about her. Shinn asked the girl maliciously if she really thought he would treat her differently, because she was protecting him, and the girl wanted to answer Shinn but didn't have time. Shinn asked the girl where she was looking because he was talking to her, but she quickly moved closer to Shinn. With quick movements, the girl grabbed a shield from one of the knights and was about to raise it over Shinn's head. Shinn sternly asked the girl if she was not going to answer him, and at that moment, a volley of enemy arrows rained down on them. Holding the shield, the girl remained silent and did not answer Shinn's question, lowering her head. Trapped in this nightmarish world of constant overload, Shinn realized that he had no allies and could trust no one. But Shinn watched closely as the girl fought the enemies on the battlefield. Looking at the girl, Shinn realized that she was different from the other soldiers in his army. Even after rebooting, she moved differently, as if she were not from this game world, and Shinn wondered why that was. Returning to Shinn, the girl looked at him, and Shinn remembered his reboots and thought about what she wanted to tell him each time. Looking sternly, Shinn couldn't calm his thoughts about what else she wanted to say. Looking at the girl, Shinn said that it didn't matter how many times he yelled at her or asked her, because he never got an answer. With an angry look, Shinn realized that it was time to change his tactics and approach. Standing opposite the girl, Shinn simply waited for the enemy arrows to rain down on them to begin the new 137th reboot simulation. When the simulation began, the gray-haired man shouted to Shinn again that the enemy army had reached the plain. Shinn silently ignored the gray-haired man because he no longer cared about any of the soldiers, considering them cowards. Passing by the soldiers at the top of the tower, Shinn also did not care about the enemy army. Approaching the girl among the knights, Shinn realized that she was the only one who mattered to him right now. Standing opposite the girl, their eyes met, and Shinn wondered what to do next and what to say. Shinn shouted to get everyone's attention so they could hear his order, and Shinn announced that he would be on the front lines during the battle. All the soldiers with the gray-haired man were shocked by this announcement, and the red-haired man asked what General Shinn was talking about. The girl was also surprised by this announcement and wanted to ask Shinn, but he interrupted her. Shinn said angrily not to argue with him because he would be in the front lines no matter what, but he wondered why the girl was so worried about him. Shouting to the soldiers to begin the battle, Shinn moved forward toward the enemies, but thinking of the girl, he wanted to show her that he too could fight without stopping and fight to the end. The gray-haired man also shouted to the soldiers to start moving and begin the battle between the enemy armies and follow the general. With anger, Shinn shouted that this time he would definitely stop all the enemies in his path. Looking at the girl behind him, Shinn thought that if he won, he would be able to hear the words she wanted to say to him, and then he would have the opportunity to find out who she was. Flying toward the enemies, Shinn realized that when he found out everything, he would be able to know exactly how to change the course of events. The girl also began to fight, and Shinn thought that with her help, he would be able to win and return home sooner. Watching the girl in battle, Shinn promised himself that in order to find out who she was, he would win this battle. Looking at his fellow soldiers, Shinn considered them weak and useless. Shinn thought this because no matter what they called themselves, generals or something else, they were either quickly destroyed or fled the battlefield. Therefore, Shinn decided to send his soldiers away and ignore them, focusing only on the knight's companion. When the enemy attacked the girl, Shinn managed to save her and realized that the time had come when he and the girl were the only ones left standing. The girl was not wounded thanks to Shinn and breathed a sigh of relief even though there were still many enemies around them. Then Shinn resolutely began to approach the girl, who was sitting on her knees and holding her sword in her hands. When he got close, Shinn spread his arms to shield the girl from the arrows flying toward them, and said that everything would be over very soon. In a panic, the girl asked General Shinn what he was doing, not understanding what was happening. Shinn just waited for the arrows to rain down on them. Shinn told the girl that she had always left him on the battlefield and gone first, and that was why Shinn had not been able to hear their last words before her death. But when the first arrow approached, Shinn began to shout that this time everything would be different, and explaining, Shinn said that he would not allow the enemies to destroy her before him. And then Shinn shouted at the girl to tell him what she had tried to say to him before she was killed and wanted her to tell him who she really was. The girl could not bear to watch Shinn's actions, and in order not to answer his question, she got up and ran towards him. To Shinn's surprise, the girl simply grabbed him around the neck, hugging him silently and saying nothing. With a few movements, the girl switched places with Shinn, and now she was protecting him from his enemies. Shinn shouted angrily and asked the girl what she was doing, but even though Shinn wanted to push her away or switch places with her again, she wouldn't let him. Then the arrows wounded the girl. Shinn asked the girl what she was trying to do, and the girl tried to answer Shinn, but it was very difficult for her after her injuries. Disappointed, Shinn realized that he would not be able to hear the girl's last words again, but this time he guessed what the girl had been trying to tell him every time. The girl had wanted to tell Shinn that she only wanted to protect him. Gritting his teeth, Shinn asked the girl what she meant by protection, even if it always ended in destruction. Holding the girl in his arms, Shinn wondered why she was trying so hard to protect him. And then Shinn realized that he didn't even know the girl's name, and had never been interested because no one had ever called her by her name. Holding the wounded girl in his arms, Shinn just sat there and denied that he even understood that this girl might be the only one Shinn could consider an ally in this game. Then Shinn began to reboot again. Shinn realized that nothing mattered anymore. Then the gray-haired man announced to General Shinn again that the enemy army was close, and the red-haired man looked at Shinn in fear. But Shinn was not concerned about all his soldiers in the camp, and he approached only the knight's girl. With a serious expression, Shinn told the girl that he was not interested in who she was, but that he had another request. Looking at the girl, Shinn simply asked her name, smiled, and even thought that he had embarrassed her with his question because she remained silent. In a calm voice, Shinn told the girl that he didn't need anything else and just wanted to know her name. Without understanding why, Shinn smiled for the first time since he had entered the game, looking at the girl. But lowering her head, the girl told Shinn that she didn't have a name, which surprised Shinn very much. Surprised, Shinn shouted how it was even possible not to have a name, and the red-haired man just sighed disappointedly behind Shinn. Shinn turned angrily to the red-haired man, asking him what he didn't like while the girl kept her head down. The man asked General Shinn if he didn't know or had forgotten the information about the knight. Then the red-haired man explained that the girl was an elite soldier of the Lee family who had been trained to achieve a great destiny, or else she was just a tool for war, nothing more and nothing less. Looking back, Shinn asked if it was really surprising to other soldiers that the girl had no name. Annoyed, the red-haired man turned to General Shinn and said that he should not worry about such trifles. The red-haired man's words angered Shinn, and he ordered him to shut up because this girl was his knight, and asked him who he was to address her as if she were an object. Shinn's angry outburst frightened the red-haired man, the gray-haired man, and all the knights present. Turning to the girl, Shinn thought that even when everyone else had betrayed him and fled, she had fought with him to the end, and even if she was just a code programmed to do so. Seeing the girl's face, Shinn remembered her efforts and every injury she had suffered in battle. Turning to the girl, Shinn told her that she was not like all the other soldiers present, but he was curious as to why she was different. Surprised, the girl told Shinn that she was no different from the others, and that she was just one of General Shinn's soldiers, so she was just like everyone else. Then Shinn smiled because it was the same answer he had heard before. Then, once again, the gray-haired man announced to General Shinn that the enemy army was approaching the plain. Taking out his sword, Shinn thought that from this moment on he would change his attitude, but he would have to go through many reboots again. But this time, watching the knights fight, Shinn felt something different. Shinn's heart beat faster and he worried that it was not fear. But this time, even though he felt excitement, everything was different. The energy boiling inside him seemed about to explode. And Shinn began to think that it was the anger that had built up inside him during all the reboots. But it was also something else. It was an unknown force that stirred inside him, and his whole body burned and itched. When the enemy army was very close, Shinn shouted to his soldiers not to retreat, and that if they had the strength to run, then they must have the strength to fight the enemies. An energy emanated from Shinn that frightened everyone present, but showed his incredible strength. Then the gray-haired man shouted to the soldiers, asking them if they had not heard the general, and to immediately stop the enemies with their own strength. While the soldiers ran to fight the enemies, Shinn turned back to the girl to address her directly. Having attracted the girl's attention, Shinn told her to listen carefully because he had an order only for her. The girl immediately knelt on one knee before her General Shinn, waiting for his special order. Shinn sternly ordered the girl that from that moment on, she was forbidden to fall under enemy fire, and that she must ensure that she was not killed before Shinn. This order greatly surprised the girl, and she did not know if she had the right to disobey General Shinn. Then Shinn told the girl that if she disobeyed this order, Shinn himself would kill her. Turning away, Shinn thought about begging the girl to stay alive until the very end. Getting up from her knees, the girl took out her sword to prepare for battle and carry out Shinn's order. Stepping forward in front of all the knights, including the girl, the gray-haired man, and the red-haired man, Shinn announced that he would lead them all. For some unknown reason, Shinn felt that he could do anything right now, even if there were 1 million or 10 million enemies. With a shout, Shinn ordered his men to attack. But in the real world, Shinn was still being watched by the game company employees, who were also monitoring his behavior. Many of the employees were no longer interested in watching Shinn and were waiting for it all to end, while one employee who had fallen asleep wondered if the simulator was still running. Putting on his glasses, the employee looked at the screen and said that it didn't matter how resilient the subject was, because Shinn should have already broken down mentally by now. But what the employee saw shocked him, and he wanted to contact the CEO. The employee shouted for the CEO, Lee, to come to the surveillance room immediately. The screen showed Shinn, who was overflowing with strange energy and fighting his enemies, destroying them. Seeing Shinn's energy on the screen, Director Lee asked with difficulty what was going on. All the employees immediately took their places and waited for instructions from Director Lee. Lee Hyung-kyu looked at the screen in fear, not understanding why Shinn was still there and continuing to fight. When Director Lee Hyung-kyu saw the girl on the screen, he didn't know who she was and wondered who had added the female knight to the simulator. Watching the girl destroy her enemies, Director Lee did not expect to see a non-game character that they had not even created in their simulator. Nervous, Director Lee looked at the girl fearfully, suspecting that she might be a bug in the game. Recalling the beginning of the game, Director Lee thought that in order to maximize the disintegration of Shinn's personality, each restart and reset allowed Shinn to feel all the pain. But even though it was a real hell that came with great risks, Director Lee and his colleagues always managed to get everything they needed. But looking at Sheena, Director Lee wondered if someone had finally appeared who could break the cycle of endless restarts. If so, then as compensation for all the reboots and suffering, Shinn would become an absurdly powerful monster. But Director Lee didn't want to believe that this was possible in the perfect simulator he had created, because Shinn was just an ignorant schoolboy. Remembering Shinn's body in the capsule, Director Lee thought that he was just an ordinary teenager who was unable to endure everything on his own. Continuing to watch, Director Lee thought that if it was because of the strange girl knight, it might be a code error and she was having a strange positive effect on Shinn and his psyche. Therefore, Director Lee shouted to the employees to immediately separate Shinn and the girl and delete her from the simulator. But if the employees couldn't do it, Director Lee ordered them to reboot and destroy Shinn. At that moment, the employees immediately took their places and began searching for information about the girl. While the employees were searching the simulator code, Shinn experienced something strange and could not understand what was happening. The enemy soldiers in front of Shinn began to move strangely, and Shinn realized that he could see everything that was happening on the battlefield, and that everything in front of him was moving as if in slow motion, even the soldiers who were very far away. An enemy soldier fired an arrow at Shinn, but he saw it very clearly, even though it was flying slowly, allowing Shinn to dodge it deftly. While Shinn dodged, the female knight behind him destroyed the enemy arrow that was approaching her. Noticing the girl, Shinn thought that just by her breathing, he could sense his unnamed girlfriend standing behind him, still following his orders. This made Shinn smile and feel confident, so he was not afraid of the enemies approaching him. Destroying all enemies in his path, Shinn was confident because he knew that from that moment on, he was ready to face anything and anyone, so he would return home no matter what. With one incredibly powerful blow, Shinn destroyed the enemies standing before him, demonstrating his strength. The enemy knights were frightened and surprised by such power, and those who were near Shinn were destroyed. A female knight joined the battle, and now she was fighting back-to-back with Shinn. While the battle raged, Shinn thought that once again he and the girl were the only ones left standing. But this did not bother Shinn much. He continued to think about how many enemies he had destroyed, perhaps dozens or hundreds, as he jumped to the next blow. Shinn was curious why the number of enemies was only increasing. In fact, the increase in enemies was due to the director's employees, who were trying to create problems for Shinn. Suddenly, the girl turned to General Shinn and asked if he could still fight, but Shinn was surprised to feel her warmth when she leaned against him. Lost in thought, Shinn realized that he knew this defied common sense, but Shinn felt an inexplicable warmth when they touched each other's cold armor. But Shinn told the girl that even if he couldn't, he had to fight. With a smile, Shinn thought that if he didn't fight in this place, he would be destroyed in a second. The girl told Shinn that fighting was a heavy burden, which surprised Shinn, and he turned to her. Continuing, the girl told Shinn that every person, no matter how peaceful their life is, has their own battlefield hidden in their heart. The girl's words touched Shinn deeply, and he tried to understand what kind of inner battlefield she was talking about. Then Shinn remembered his life in the real world, how he went to the academy and then met his friends to play games. The girl told Shinn that it was very easy to lose on this battlefield because he could simply give up. But Shinn did not like the words about losing. Continuing to fight, the girl said that it was a very easy decision to give up, but that at that moment, the decision would bring everything to an end. But if Shinn didn't back down and fought to the end, the girl said that the internal battle would be with him until the end. This surprised Shinn, but it became clear why. Despite all the reboots, he was able to survive and continue to stand on the battlefield. Shinn was very happy that behind him, standing next to him, was the girl who had become his comrade, and Shinn asked her why she was still protecting him. The girl looked into the distance silently, and Shinn knew he might not get an answer, but he wanted to ask her anyway. Shinn said sternly that he had to know and begged the girl to answer him. Surprised, the girl turned to Shinn, and he thought it was because she had become the battlefield he could no longer abandon. Looking back, Shinn thought that he didn't even need to turn his head to follow the girl's gaze, and realized that his senses were heightened, and he could feel her approaching. But lost in thought, Shinn said that the only thing they had never been able to overcome from the very beginning was the rain of arrows. When Shinn felt the arrows flying, he turned to the girl to plan what to do next. Reminding her, Shinn told the girl that she still hadn't answered his question from earlier and asked if she was giving up. Looking back at Shinn, it was difficult to tell what the girl was feeling, but it was clear from her face that something was bothering her. But the arrows were already very close, and the enemy army was approaching Shinn and his knight. At that moment, the girl dropped her sword and began to move closer to Shinn. Shinn realized that the girl's steps were different from those he had seen before. Shinn realized that there was no sadness or uncertainty in the girl's steps. Shinn looked at her in surprise, and it seemed to him that the girl was in no hurry at all. The girl just looked mysteriously at Shinn, and he thought that her steps were only for him. And when the girl approached Shinn, she hugged him tightly, which surprised Shinn very much. Arrows began to fall to the ground and wound the soldiers, but the girl did not let go of Shinn to protect him. Then the girl told Shinn that she was not going to surrender to General Shinn, that it was simply impossible, and her words surprised Shinn. Hugging Shinn tightly and holding him, the girl said that she, like him, would never admit defeat. In his mind, Shinn thought that after going through this endless cycle of reboots, he believed he had grown accustomed to these battles. But right now, looking at the girl, Shinn realized that there was one thing he couldn't get used to. Shinn shouted angrily, asking the girl what she was doing and ordering her to take her hands off him immediately. Shinn began to break the arrows so that they would not hurt the girl. Then Shinn reminded the girl of his order when he told her not to let them kill her before he did. The girl was faced with a choice, either the general or obey the order. While Shinn was deflecting the arrows, he ordered her to stop. Unfortunately, Shinn was unable to deflect all the arrows, and some still wounded the girl, who said that she was just like the general. Still embracing Shinn, the girl said that the general would also never give up his life. Director Lee watched everything happening on the battlefield, while his subordinates tried to change the simulator program. Shinn begged the girl not to leave him, and when he felt that she was having trouble standing, Shinn turned her around to carry her on his back. Shinn angrily began to shout at the girl to open her eyes because he knew she was still conscious. Shinn reminded the girl that she herself had said not to give up. Holding the girl on his back, Shinn shouted that she had said to hold on until the end, so that their story would last forever. Shinn also emphasized that he would never abandon her, just as she had never abandoned him. Tears were already welling up in Shinn's eyes, but he continued to shout and begged the girl to open her eyes immediately. Then the girl suddenly coughed, and Shinn realized that she was still alive. He didn't let go of her and silently begged her not to leave him. Encouraging himself, Shinn told himself to keep moving and not to stop. And in his mind, Shinn understood that despite his fatigue and injuries, he had to go on. Lifting the girl onto his back, Shinn began to move because it was their only chance to survive no matter what. Shinn's sword was lying nearby and he grabbed it and began to emit a strong, strange aura. While the girl was breathing heavily, Shinn shouted at her not to lose consciousness and begged her to hold on a little longer. In his mind, Shinn wanted to save the girl no matter what. But holding the girl, the situation was difficult for Shinn because enemies were surrounding them and approaching. Looking hard, Shinn cursed Director Lee Hyung-gyu, while Director Lee looked at the screen behind Shinn and seemed to understand his thoughts. Hearing the girl cough, Shinn realized that time was running out and he couldn't afford to get distracted. If Shinn wanted to survive, he had to hurry up and move forward, even though his strength was running out. Even though Shinn felt sick and weak, he had to keep moving, and then he shouted as if to take a second breath. Shinn felt as if his body was in agony, but at the same time, he felt an unknown force boiling inside him. Saying to himself, Shinn shouted to keep moving, and then, with a surge of strength, Shinn began to destroy all the enemies who approached him and the girl. Such power greatly surprised Director Lee Hyung-kyu, who was watching the battle on the screen, and he began to shout to his subordinates, asking where Shinn got such abilities. One of the subordinates replied to Director Lee that it was difficult for them to understand the reason for Shinn's strength, and he nervously asked what was happening, looking at his monitor, which was beginning to display strange errors. Watching Shinn's blow, his subordinates found something similar to Black Vin's blow in his strength. After destroying most of the enemies nearby, there were still some enemy knights left who were very frightened, but Shinn was still holding the girl on his back. Then the girl found the strength to address General Shinn, which surprised him greatly. The girl said that before it was too late, she had a request and asked Shinn if he could give her a name. Very surprised, Shinn wanted to turn to the girl and clarify her question, wondering what her name was and why she was asking for it now. Shinn said he would do it later and asked the girl to wait. But being in a difficult situation, the girl began to shake her head, indicating that she wanted her request to be fulfilled now. This surprised Shinn because she had obeyed his commands without question until then. Then the girl explained to Shinn that if he gave her a name now, she would never forget it. Deciding to grant the girl's request, Shinn looked at the sun and the enemies nearby and thought about what name to give her. Then, with a smile, Shinn said that from now on the girl would be called Sepia. Sepia liked the name and smiled too. With joy in her eyes and a broad smile, Sepia told Shinn that it was a very beautiful name, and that it reminded her of a reed field against the backdrop of the red sunset in her hometown. At that moment, Sepia laid her head on Shinn, and he felt her body grow weaker on his back. Then Shinn promised Sepia that he would never abandon her. But the strange aura began to fade from Shinn, and the enemy soldiers decided that this was their chance. While Shinn held the weakened girl on his back and prepared for the next restart, the enemy knights approached them. Then Shinn's 138th simulation session ended, and Director Lee Hyung-gyu watched him nervously. Director Lee thought that this time they had managed to stop Shinn, but he did not think that an ordinary schoolboy could become so strong. Suddenly, one of the subordinates called out to Director Lee, who asked what was going on this time. The subordinate said that he seemed to have found a way to separate Shinn and the knight Sepia's girlfriend. Meanwhile, while Shinn was rebooting, he punished himself for not being able to save Sepia, and even if Shinn managed to use the strange energy, he still couldn't break through the ranks. But in the new 139th reboot, Shinn decided that this time he would definitely fulfill his duty to save Sepia, even if it meant destroying all his enemies. Hearing the gray-haired man's voice again, Shinn wanted to see the knight Sepia as soon as possible. Unexpectedly, Shinn began to shout Sepia's name, which surprised the knights nearby because no one understood who he was talking about. Shinn was worried and remembered Sepia's words that she would never forget that name. But looking around, Shinn wondered why he couldn't find Sepia anywhere, and then he saw only her sword lying on the ground. Nervously, Shinn began to shout louder and ask Sepia where she had gone, which surprised the knights nearby even more. The red-haired boy asked General Shinn who he was looking for and who he was talking about. In fact, the red-haired boy looked at Shinn with contempt and felt uncomfortable calling him general. The boy believed that Shinn had inherited the mantle of a greater predecessor and was an empty vessel. Remembering the past, Shinn showed himself to be a coward and a piece of trash who only knew how to run away, which was how the red-haired man remembered him. But now the red-haired man was nervous because he did not understand what had happened, because now a completely different Shinn was standing in front of him. Looking at Shinn, the red-haired man radiated an aura that only a true general could have. Shinn angrily demanded that those around him tell him where Sepia was. The gray-haired man came up to Shinn and said calmly that only God knew where the man Shinn was talking about was. Then Shinn grabbed the gray-haired man by the collar, but the knights drew their swords without Shinn's command, more concerned for the gray-haired captain. With an evil smile, Shinn told those around him that he knew very well that the knights would rather follow the gray-haired man than him. Holding the gray-haired man, Shinn said that he also knew that the captain considered him stupid and cowardly. This frightened the gray-haired man, and he panicked at Shinn's words. Shinn glared at those around him, frightening them, and no one knew what would happen next. Then, with a cry, Shinn angrily lifted the gray-haired man even higher and declared that he himself was a general. This surprised everyone present, and the red-haired man, in shock, calculated that, considering his armor, the gray-haired man must weigh more than 100 kilograms. Yet Shinn had managed to lift him with ease. The gray-haired man's name was Hallenberg. He was the captain of the knights and a knight of an order that had an entire squad under his command. The red-haired man believed that this was not a man that the young Shinn could defeat using only his own strength. Shinn shouted angrily that he didn't care what the other knights thought of him, and that he was only interested in one thing. The only thing that interested Shinn was where the knight Sepia had gone, because earlier Sepia had been standing among all the other knights, and now she was gone. The frightened red-haired boy thought that General Shinn had gone mad and wondered who Sepia was. In shock, the red-haired man shouted to General Shinn that they did not understand who Sepia was and asked him to release Captain Hallenberg. Then Shinn turned to the red-haired man with a smile, which was very confusing. The red-haired man did not understand where Shinn's cunning came from, and thought that it could not be that the young Shinn had frightened him. Then Shinn released Captain Hallenberg at the request of the red-haired boy. But immediately Shinn approached the red-haired boy and this time grabbed him. This time, Shinn grabbed the red-haired boy by the neck and lifted him up, just like he had done with Captain Hallenberg. And Shinn said that the tough red-haired boy should answer him. Rising from the ground, Captain Hallenberg shouted at General Shinn and wondered how he could move like that. Hallenberg begged Shinn to calm down and said that there was no one named Sepia here, and that there were no civilians here either. Then Shinn kicked Captain Hallenberg aside, which surprised the knights even more. Shinn shouted angrily that Sepia was no peaceful civilian, but someone whom none of the knights present could compare to, because Sepia was a knight among knights. In his mind, Shinn understood that Sepia was his only friend in this world of endless reboots, and shouted that she was the owner of the 1.5. And then Captain Hallenberg turned his attention to him. Seeing the 1.5 horse on the ground, Captain Hallenberg asked Shinn if he was talking about number 232. These words angered Shinn, and he began to slowly approach Commander Hallenberg, who was lying on the ground. Looking at Shinn, Hallenberg was frightened that Shinn's shadow was scaring him, and wondered if this shadow really belonged to the cowardly heir he had known back then. Looking at Shinn, Hallenberg saw a resemblance between Shinn's aura and that of the Supreme Commander of the Black Vin Empire, and analyzing Shinn's appearance, Hallenberg thought that his ancestor looked exactly the same. Grabbing Hallenberg by the neck again, Shinn said that the girl's name was Sepia, and that she was definitely not number 232, and asked where she was right now. Frightened, Hallenberg replied to General Shinn that he only knew that Sepia was in the infirmary. Shinn did not understand what Sepia was doing there, and ordered the knights to take him to the infirmary immediately. Shinn and the knights headed to one of the towers of their castle, and Shinn was very angry, his aura still present. When Shinn entered the infirmary first, he shouted Sepia's name loudly and searched for her among those present. All the injured and doctors were surprised by Shinn's arrival and had not heard of Sepia, but suddenly Shinn saw her on the bed, and next to her was a nurse changing her towel. Rushing forward, Shinn pushed away all the nurses who were in his way, but he didn't care. He was only concerned about Sepia. Standing in front of her bed where she lay unconscious, Shinn wondered what was going on. Seeing Sepia's face, Shinn realized nervously that she had been injured in the battle, but why was the story different now? One of the nurses approached General Shinn and asked him why he was there. Shinn only asked what had happened to Sepia. Checking Sepia's condition, the nurse replied that she was sorry, but they also did not know what had happened. The nurse explained that Sepia had been in the infirmary for 10 days and had been in this condition the entire time. Unable to believe his ears, Shinn couldn't believe that Sepia could have been in the infirmary for 10 days because in the previous reboots they had been fighting side by side, and now she was here. Smiling angrily, Shinn thought he remembered where he was and that this stage was between director Lee Hyung-gu because he was capable of doing this. Shinn asked the nurse if Sepia would ever wake up. The nurses replied that it was difficult to say and asked General Shinn to keep quiet while he was in the infirmary. Sadly, Shinn wondered if he would ever see Sepia open her eyes and wake up again. Then Shinn placed his hand on her bed. Disappointed, Shinn wondered if he could only watch Sepia die. Suddenly, one of the nurses told Shinn that he would be fine and that he could do it. Worried about General Shinn, the nurse said that if it was the Virgin Mary, then she could cure any illness. Therefore, Shinn had to bring Mary to Sepia to save her. Hearing these words of hope, Shinn asked what he needed to do to meet the Virgin Mary. The nurse replied that there was only one way, and that was to win the battle. Shinn was then filled with determination. Looking at Sepia's face, Shinn understood that there was hope as long as the nurses supported him, and told him that he had a chance to save her. After some thought, Shinn began to speak, surprising those present, but he did not continue his sentence and again plunged into his thoughts. Standing over Sepia, Shinn thought that if he wanted to see her again, he had no choice but to win the battle. But after thinking it over, Shinn realized that this was indeed the case, and that it was quite simple. So Shinn decided that he would save Sepia, and then they would fight side by side again until the very end for the sake of returning home. Then Shinn's army rushed into the infirmary and reported that all the military headquarters had been destroyed, and the enemy would soon be in their camp. Raising his head, Shinn said that the time had come to fight to the last moment, and in his mind, Shinn begged Sepia to wait a little longer, because only then would this battle finally end. With a smile, Shinn looked at Sepia with these thoughts filled with determination and a desire for victory. Standing over Sepia, Shinn realized that he had never admitted it. But in fact, during these countless battles, he had thought about giving up more than once. But thanks to Sepia, Shinn believed that he could overcome all this hell because Shinn saw Sepia, who seemed to be telling him that she would always protect him. Reaching out to Sepia in bed, Shinn said that when Sepia disappeared, he felt very lonely. And if he lost Sepia, these enemies would simply destroy Shinn. But now Shinn understands that he has a reason to fight. Once again, using his boundless power and terrifying aura, Shinn told his enemies on the battlefield that he would not give up until he won and returned home to save Sepia, no matter what. Overcome with rage, Shinn used his incredible power to destroy the enemies in his path and terrify them with his strange energy. But no matter how hard the enemies tried to get close to Shinn and hurt him, they couldn't because Shinn destroyed them faster. Shinn told himself that he would fight to the end and destroy all his enemies to achieve his goal. Shouting at his enemies before his attacks, Shinn thought that he was just getting warmed up in this battle. Destroying even the castle buildings, Shinn moved forward resolutely toward his victory, filled with rage. But his enemies weren't going to give up that easily, so they kept attacking Shinn. When there were too many enemies, Shinn decided to use a special attack. Raising his sword, Shinn used his strength and energy to destroy the enemies who had come very close to him. But at that moment of the battle, Shinn was not frightened by his enemies, but by his own subordinates, who, seeing what was happening, began to flee from the army. While Shinn was destroying his enemies, he saw that his knights, including the red-haired boy and Captain Hallenberg, were running away from the battlefield like cowards. When Shinn met the red-haired boy and Captain Hallenberg, he was disappointed in their actions and showed it on his face. Then Shinn called them liars. Then Shinn's 149th restart began. During the battle, Shinn thought that at some point, the thought had entered his head that this was an endless loop of hell, and he wondered when it would end. And now that Sepia was not with Shinn, he did not want to be destroyed countless times and lose again and again without any change. And in the end, amid his suffering, Shinn would now have to fight alone without Sepia. And remembering his cowardly subordinates, Shinn realized that they were not to be relied upon because his knights would not even think about Shinn, but would simply flee. But suddenly Shinn wondered why they were trying to run away because their lives depended on this battle. Starting a new restart, Shinn found himself in the rain again. Then Shinn began to address the knights and asked if reinforcements were already nearby. Surprised, Captain Hallenberg turned around and asked Shinn what he was talking about. The other knights were also surprised by this question. In a calm voice, Shinn asked why they were so surprised, as he had only asked if reinforcements had arrived. Frightened, Captain Hallenberg asked Shinn again what he was talking about and what reinforcements he meant. This response was expected by Shinn, and he smiled and told Captain Hallenberg that he thought he had an army that Shinn didn't even know about. This made all the knights nervous, and they opened their mouths in surprise but remained silent, staring at Shinn. Laughing, Shinn thought that there was no point in asking, but he wondered why they had hidden this information from him. With a smile, Shinn exhaled and said that he now understood what his knights had come up with. The red-haired knight shouted at Shinn, asking what he meant. clearly panicking. Shinn said sternly that they had used archers to buy time, and Shinn understood that it was all a lie and a trick to frame Shinn. Remembering how Captain Hallenberg had begged Shinn to start giving orders, Shinn realized that it was all a lie because they didn't even expect anything from Shinn. The way Captain Hallenberg pressured Shinn and shouted at him to do something was just to intimidate and destroy him. Suddenly, a red-haired guy shouted at Shinn, asking if he was a descendant of the great Li family. Shinn understood that his knights just wanted to get rid of him while waiting for reinforcements. And when Shinn first got into this game, the knights had no respect for him, because they just needed a clown dressed as a general. Shinn was desperate and didn't know what to do. But he still had hope for his army, which was simply deceiving him. Returning from his thoughts about the past, Shinn said that there was no explanation other than what his knights had done. Shinn understood that from the very beginning, he had been surrounded by desperate people who just wanted to get rid of him by sending him to Blackhaven. Frightened, Captain Hallenberg tried to address General Shinn, but did not even know what to say. With irony, Shinn addressed Captain Hallenberg as if trying to remember his name, and turned to the red-haired boy named Joseph. Joseph was frightened by Shinn's address to them and asked questions because he suspected something strange. With a smile, Shinn said that whatever Joseph and Hallenberger's beliefs and views were, from that moment on, Shinn ordered them not to be hypocritical. Unexpectedly, Joseph shouted at Shinn that it was necessary and that they had no other choice. Then Shinn understood why they had done what they did. With a smile, Shinn said that it turned out that his knights had no other hope for a way out, except the one they had come up with. But Shinn knew that of all these knights, no one believed in his victory except one person, and that was Sepia. Lost in thought, Shinn thought that if he were in their place, he might not have been much different from them. So Shinn said aloud that it was a good plan, but he reminded them that he had to win this battle. And so Shinn viciously ordered that from that moment on, they would no longer wait for reinforcements. This surprised all the knights who were present, and had been hoping for additional help. Meanwhile, shocked Joseph wondered how Shinn could say such nonsense. Unexpectedly, Captain Hallenberg placed his sword in front of Shinn, as if he were about to disobey his order. Captain Hallenberg asked General Shinn angrily if he really thought this battle was some kind of game. Disappointed, Shinn looked at him and thought that they were cowards who wanted to run away before the battle even began, and were now looking down on Shinn. But even destruction could not save Shinn from these endless reboots. And remembering his attempts, Shinn realized that even if he was destroyed, he couldn't stop, because otherwise this hell would never end for him. Then Shinn shouted to all the knights, giving the order that he would not repeat himself, and emphasized that everyone should gather in front of the castle gates. With a shout, Shinn announced his order that the knights must lead all the horses out of the gates immediately. Meanwhile, the enemy army was approaching the castle where Shinn and his army of knights were. Shinn's knights had no choice but to obey General Shinn's order, so they all took their horses and led them to the gate. Worried, Captain Hallenberg also began to carry out the order, and asked one of his subordinates if he had led all the horses out. This man was a groom and informed Captain Hallenberg that he had led all the horses out as General Shinn had ordered, but there was something else. The groom reported that there was one horse that refused to leave and resisted moving from the spot. No matter how hard the other knights tried to lead her out, the horse injured those who tried to approach her. After listening to the groom, Captain Hallenberg realized that they were talking about General Li's horse. When all the knights had finished their preparations, General Shinn came out to check on them. Shinn looked sternly down at everyone from the hill and asked if everyone was in their places. Nervously, Captain Hallenberg replied to General Shinn that everyone was in place, and asked what he planned to do next. Then Shinn said he wanted to open the gates. Frightened, Captain Hallenberg asked what they needed to open. Pointing to the gate where the army had gathered, Shinn ordered them to open it. Seeing the fear in the knights' eyes, Shinn told everyone to listen to their general, and that they would open the gates, then go out and break through the enemy army and take advantage of their enemy's focus on attacking the walls. The frightened warriors stood with their mouths open, staring silently at Shinn, unable to respond. Shinn announced that after destroying the enemy army, they would head to Black Vin's camp to fight and destroy him there, driving the enemies from their lands. Most likely, Black Vin was waiting further away among his warriors, and Shinn wanted to get to him. Shinn imagined how he would come face to face with Black Vin, calling him a monster, and could not wait to destroy him. With a cry, Shinn announced that this was their only way to survive, and only then would Shinn be able to win the battle. Standing in front of his army on the steps, Shinn showed his confidence and leadership. Then, unexpectedly, the horse that had been left in the stable came to its senses and wanted to join the army. The knights shouted that Joseph's hands were shaking and asked if they really wanted the army to go into battle and win this fight. Laughing, Joseph asked Shinn if this was his plan and what he was thinking. Shinn looked sternly at Joseph without saying a word. Joseph asked Shinn to answer, asking if he had lost his mind and was trying to lead them to their destruction. Hallenberg asked Joseph how he dared to speak to General Shinn that way. Joseph asked Shinn how he planned to storm the enemy army with so many troops. Joseph called Shinn a fool who couldn't see beyond his own nose. Then Shinn shouted that they couldn't understand the situation they were in. Shinn asked his army if they had any brains because they really thought that Black Vin would let them live if they humbly bowed their heads after he destroyed Shinn. Shinn said this because he knew that Black Vin would not listen to pleas, and that it was useless. At that moment, something happened near the stables and some pieces of wood flew straight at the soldiers. When Joseph stood up, he saw a white horse in front of him and realized that it was indeed the former general's horse. But the horse seemed angry, bellowing loudly and preparing to run out of the stable. The surprised soldiers began to discuss the appearance of the general's horse and wondered why it was there and how it had gotten out. This caught Shinn's attention because he had never seen this unusual horse before, and no one had told him about it. Frightened, Joseph began to shout at the soldiers, asking them what they were doing and ordering them to catch the horse and calm it down immediately. The groom and the soldiers tried to stop the horse, but it pushed away everyone who tried to attack it. The soldiers did not understand the horse's behavior and wondered why it could not stand still. The soldiers devised a plan to catch the horse and caught it with ropes to force it to stand still. But no matter how hard the knights pulled, the horse still resisted and tried to escape from captivity. Surprised, the soldiers shouted that the horse had not even moved, and behind them all stood Shinn, watching everything that was happening. The frightened soldiers wondered what was wrong with this horse and where it got such great strength. Then Shinn jumped in front of all the knights, drawing his sword as if preparing for battle, and approached the horse. But in reality, Shinn cut the ropes that were holding the horse, causing all the soldiers to fall to the ground, and no one understood what was happening. Shinn told the soldiers that if he just stood there watching, he thought the knights would be the first to be destroyed by the horse in its path, which surprised his subordinates. Captain Hallenberg shouted to General Shinn not to approach the horse because it was no ordinary horse. Then Shinn turned his attention to Hallenberg. But Shinn was curious as to why the horse had become so angry and started knocking all the knights to the ground. Looking at the horse, Shinn suspected that it was trying to say something with its strange behavior. Meanwhile, the enemy knights had already approached the castle and began attacking Shinn's knights and their defenses. With a smile, Sheena understood what the horse was trying to tell him and why it was behaving so strangely. Suddenly, the horse ran quickly toward Shinn, causing panic among the knights present because the horse could harm General Shinn. Captain Hallenberg shouted to General Shinn that it was dangerous for him, but he was actually worried that the horse would kill Shinn, and their plan would fail. But to the surprise of the knights, the horse did not touch General Shinn and tried to run past him to reach the knights. At that moment, Shinn grabbed one of the ropes left on the horse's neck and pulled it toward him, trying to stop it. Although the horse managed to knock some of the knights off their feet, Shinn still managed to stop the horse with incredible strength and a strange aura. With a smile, Shinn said that it was even fun, and Shinn suspected that the horse felt the same way he did. Looking at the horse, which had calmed down a little, Shinn thought that they both felt the desire to fool around on the terrible battlefield. One more time. Shinn praised the horse and said that it deserved respect. Shinn resolutely pulled the horse toward him and decided that it was time for them to move together in this world and on the battlefield until the very end. Remembering Black Vin and the battles between Shinn and the horse, a strange connection appeared while Shinn thought that battles awaited them that would show no mercy to anyone and destroy everything and everyone in their path. With a malicious smile, Shinn emphasized to the knights that it was time to fight their way to the lion's throat and heart, hinting at Black Vin. Pulling his horse toward him, Shinn released his incredible energy, showing his strength to his comrade. Meanwhile, the horse remembered its former owner, General Shinn's father, and there was an incredible resemblance between them. Shinn was as determined and strong as his father, even if his first attempts were unsuccessful. Now Shinn was much stronger. Then the horse bowed its head before Shinn, showing its loyalty. This surprised all the knights present, including Joseph. Frightened, Joseph could not believe his eyes and could only guess how Shinn had managed to befriend the general's fearsome horse. Meanwhile, the horse lowered its hooves to show its devotion to Shinn, who was still demonstrating his strength to the horse. Meanwhile, Director Lee watched Shinn and scolded the simulator for failing to achieve the set goal. Director Lee denied any violations of the program he had created. Meanwhile, Shinn mounted the horse and rode out of the gate with the army. Shinn was riding a horse for the first time and wondered if it was the same in the real world. To Shinn's surprise, he felt no discomfort or fear of falling off the horse, but he had his suspicions. Looking at the horse, Shinn thought that maybe it was because of him, and the horse was picking up the pace because it could sense his clumsiness. With a smile, Shinn said that a horse was just an animal, so he told it to run as it wished and assured it that he would be fine. In his mind, Shinn understood that thanks to his heightened senses, which he had managed to awaken, he no longer needed to worry. Meanwhile, the horse looked back, chose the best direction, and ran forward toward the enemies, leading Shinn. Shinn's army advanced toward the enemy troops while they were distracted by climbing the castle walls. Shinn was not stopped by anything, and he said loudly to himself that he would break through the army. Taking his spear, Shinn threw it at the enemy army, which had just noticed Shinn's army, which was already close. The spear was thrown with such force that it destroyed not one enemy but several who were in its path. Only then did the enemy army realize that Sheena's knights were not in the castle, and that they had now entered from the side. But Black Vin continued to stare at the castle, thinking that Shinn's tower would soon be destroyed. But as he pondered, Black Vin thought of General Li Yu Shin, the man who had destroyed his left eye. Remembering the smile of the former general, Black Vin expressed his hatred for this man, and his satisfaction that he had managed to destroy him in the past. But now his descendant was in this castle, and now it was time to destroy the son of the former General Shinn. Returning to the past, Black Vin remembered the gossip he had heard from other warriors who spoke of Shinn as a pathetic and spineless warrior. Thinking about this, Black Vin wondered if it was true and analyzed how best to strike Shinn and how to destroy him. Then Black Vin just looked around, thinking about his dark deeds, not even suspecting what was happening behind his back. But in the meantime, Shinn's spear destroyed a significant number of enemies, and then Shinn drew his sword, preparing for the next attack, jumping on his horse. The enemy army realized that they had fallen into an ambush and raised their spears to defend themselves and try to stop Shinn. Nothing could stop the evil Shinn in his attack, and he was so strong that even while jumping, he could destroy his enemies and their weapons. The horse stood on their enemies, and Shinn, with his incredible strength, knocked his enemies off their feet and destroyed them. The enemy soldiers announced that Shinn was alone and gave the order not to retreat. The enemies devised a plan to surround Shinn and destroy him. But Shinn was not afraid, so he used his horse to make sharp turns and confuse his enemies. With all his strength, Shinn shouted, as if exploding with power, and destroyed one enemy after another. Black Vin turned to Shinn and asked him not to disappoint him, because he was the descendant of a great man. Meanwhile, Shinn rode his horse forward, destroying all the enemies that were very close to him. Confidently, Shinn smiled as he destroyed his enemies, thinking that he had only just begun his fight. Destroying his enemies, Shinn left behind a seemingly empty path, but continued to fight his enemies. This surprised Shinn's knights, but they realized that Shinn had paved the way for them, and the knights decided to follow Shinn. Captain Hallenberg, along with Josephine and the knights, began to run along Shinn's path, helping him by knocking down his enemies. Shinn loudly told his men that if they did not want to be destroyed, they should not fall behind him, and announced that they must move forward only straight to Blackhaven. In order to fight more effectively, Shinn took out a sword and another spear to perform a double attack. When Shinn performed his double attack, many knights were destroyed and some were thrown to the sides. And then Black Vin noticed that there had just been a strange aura with incredible power somewhere among his knights. Black Vin's frightened knights rushed to their commander on their horses, calling out to him. Black Vin sternly asked his knights what was going on and what kind of circus was this. The worried knights told Black Vin that it was an ambush by enemy troops. Black Vin asked what nonsense they were talking about, and who was brave enough to ambush them. Black Vin thought that perhaps there was someone quick-witted in the castle if they had done such a thing. One of his subordinates said that he did not believe it either, but that it was true and that the one leading the army was none other than Li Yu-Shin. While Li Yu-Shin was destroying the enemy army reported to Black Vin what had happened on the battlefield. Surprised, Black Vin couldn't believe that Li Yu-Shin was leading the army, and then told his subordinate that if he was lying, he would punish him for his lying tongue. Frightened, Black Vin's subordinate told his general that he was completely sure of his words. At that moment, General Black Vin laughed madly at everything that was happening and what he had been told. Black Vin thought that those who told him about Shinn were stupid if they called him a coward. Black Vin was sure that Li Yu-Shin was crazy, and that no sane man would even dare to think about breaking through to them. But Black Vin couldn't believe that Shinn had come to him in person, and he thought it was commendable, so Black Vin wanted to prepare a surprise for Shinn. When the enemy army wanted to attack Shinn's knights, they began to panic and behave awkwardly. Shinn didn't care how many enemy soldiers there were, whether thousands or tens of thousands. Shinn told them in his mind to stop him if they dared. But despite everything, Shinn decided to move forward right behind Black Vin. Suddenly, one of the knights of the enemy army sounded a horn, and after that, the enemy knights stopped their attack. Taken by surprise, Shinn looked back, expecting something strange, and did not understand what the enemy army would do next. But the enemy army seemed to let Shinn pass, opening the way for him and stopping their attack. And then, further down the road, Shinn saw 3 unknown but unusual knights on horseback, as well as the silhouette of the one Shinn had been waiting for so long. When Shinn saw Black Vin, who seemed to be beckoning Shinn with his hand, his eyes turned white with rage and he began to show his power with a strange energy. Smiling, Black Vin realized that the strange aura did indeed belong to Li Yu-Shin. Shinn shouted at Black Vin in anger and rushed forward toward him. Shinn felt that all he needed was his sword. Shinn's actions surprised his entire army and even the enemy army, because no one could believe that Shinn was capable of such a thing. Director Lee and his team were still watching Shinn and were also surprised by his behavior and actions. Black Vin also revealed his aura and through it, his power, but Shinn was not afraid and decided to do what he had to do. Shinn understood that he still could not fully control his new powers, but he knew that a moment would be enough. Shinn tried to concentrate on the blade of his sword. Beginning to attack while riding his horse, Shinn was determined to destroy Black Vin. But looking at Li Yu-Shin approaching Black Vin, he thought it was simply incredible. Black Vin needed Shinn to be at least inspired. And then Black Vin shouted to Shinn that he wanted to enjoy destroying him. But Shinn didn't care what Black Vin shouted, and both began to swing their swords. The blow was so powerful that it blinded all the knights from both armies. Black Vin struck with his huge axe, and Shinn parried his attack with his sword. Black Vin was surprised. He did not expect Shinn to be able to block his strongest attack. No one could have imagined that Shinn would be able to repel the attack of Black Vin, the messenger of Nemea, and the embodiment of a lion. In his mind, Black Vin called Shinn a small and inexperienced boy, which angered him greatly. Enraged, Black Vin began to advance on Shinn and strike him repeatedly. Meanwhile, Shinn thought that he had been expecting this battle, but Black Vin was still incredibly strong. While fending off Black Vin's attacks, Shinn thought that in the end he would still be pushed back. Shinn was not going to give up when he had come this far, so he changed his position and began to strike Black Vin himself. But Black Vin continued to fend off Shinn's attacks and strike him with incredible force. After one of the attacks, Shinn lost his balance and fell from his horse, landing on the ground. Thanks to his sword, Shinn was able to stay on his feet and remain on the ground, while Black Vin decided to take advantage of the moment and strike. Shinn watched Black Vin and assessed his strength and attacks, still managing to dodge his moves. Black Vin shouted at Shinn, asking him where his energy had gone and whether he had finished pretending to be the heir to a great man. In his mind, Shinn couldn't wait to destroy Black Vin, and when he found the right moment, he was ready to attack. But Black Vin was no longer where he had been standing, and his horse ran past Shinn, which seemed strange to Shinn, and he wondered where he was. Looking up, Shinn saw Black Vin in the sky, flying toward him, gathering strength for an attack. Shinn believed that he had become stronger, but it was already difficult for him to move his fingers. There was a large gap between Shinn and Black Vin, and it felt as if they were from different species. But even if Black Vin wanted to launch another powerful attack, Shinn managed to block it with his sword. Suddenly, Black Vin told Shinn that he was very sorry, but it seemed that their fun was over. And then Shinn saw that Black Vin's blow had broken his sword, and the blow destroyed Shinn after all. Shinn did not think that there was such a big difference between them. But before rebooting again, Shinn looked at Black Vin and understood something. In his mind, Shinn understood that everything usually ended with a critical blow, so he didn't know what would happen next. But if he used such powerful force constantly, Shinn realized that even Black Vin would eventually tire. Before restarting, Shinn said that then he had only one option left, and now he knew what to do and how to move forward. Then the simulation was complete, and Shinn was ranked 6th, as determined by the calculations of the data accumulated in the knowledge points. Shinn couldn't believe that Black Vin could get tired. But after analyzing it, Shinn realized that no matter how strong Black Vin was, if he used his strongest attack, he would still get tired. In his thoughts, Shinn realized that if his very first attack was the best, then he had 60 seconds to hold out until Black Vin reached his maximum strength. Shinn decided that he had to withstand the critical blow. When Shinn restarted the simulation, he repeated everything to get to Black Vin on the battlefield. But now Shinn did not try to strike, only dodging Black Vin's blows. After a few more restarts, Shinn decided that sometimes it was necessary to defend himself against Black Vin's blows. This seemed to annoy Black Vin, but smiling, he wanted to have more fun fighting Shinn. Shinn had 30 seconds left, and to satisfy Black Vin, he began to attack him as well. But Black Vin was expecting this and simply dodged Shinn's attacks, who was not ready for this. Black Vin grabbed Shinn by the head and threw him back to knock him off his feet. Grabbing Shinn and throwing him to the ground, Black Vin grabbed a spear to deliver the fatal blow to Shinn. Shinn began a new restart and decided to change tactics to hold out longer. And when Shinn had seen Black Vin's attacks several times, he was easily able to dodge them and avoid falling into his hands. Shinn defended himself, waiting for the moment when Black Vin would finally tire and he would have the opportunity to destroy him. While the other knights watched, Shinn thought that this battle, or perhaps his entire time in this hell, had been predestined. Shinn thought that the things he had gone through and these endless restarts meant something. After the attack, Shinn had 10 seconds left before Black Vin got tired. Shinn took his sword and thought that he had to endure, even if he was almost destroyed. Shinn began the countdown when Black Vin finally grew tired. Shinn's actions began to annoy him, and he asked how Shinn dared to behave that way. In his mind, Shinn knew that losing this battle was very easy, and remembering Sepia's words, he could have simply given up. But Shinn remembered how Sepia had protected him every time he restarted, no matter what, and asked him to fight to the end. And remembering Sepia, Shinn thought of her words that if he wanted to, the fight would continue. Overflowing with strength and anger, Shinn said that it was time to end the fight, and when Black Vin finally got tired, Shinn prepared his attack. At that moment, Shinn's rank increased to 3rd, and he received the title of Master Knight. Black Vin did not expect such determination from Shinn. Satisfied, Shinn believed that he had withstood Black Vin's strongest attacks in this battle and was ready to destroy him. All the other knights present did not expect Shinn to be able to wound Black Vin and throw him aside. Even Director Lee and his team who were watching Shinn and their battle were surprised. Then Black Vin began to worry that there was a chance he would lose to Shinn. Black Vin considered Shinn a guy he had underestimated because he only had his father's fame. Black Vin decided that he couldn't just lose and let Shinn live because he could become a danger to the entire empire. Then Black Vin became angry and, devising a plan, wanted to destroy Shinn no matter what. Turning to his army, Black Vin shouted at them, asking why they were just standing there watching, and then ordered them to destroy Shinn immediately. Enraged, Black Vin looked at Shinn and ordered his army to destroy him and then take him back to the Empire. The enemy army was ready to attack, but the whole situation with Black Vin made Shinn laugh. With a smile, Shinn told Black Vin that he considered him a true general, and that he couldn't believe Black Vin was asking someone for help, just because he realized that Shinn was a threat. Looking sternly at Black Vin, Shinn told him that he was no different from his pathetic army. Shinn's words angered Black Vin, but he did not know how to respond to the accusation. Shinn understood that he had gone through this hell only because he had defeated all his enemies, and Shinn shouted at Black Vin to take his huge axe and run towards him. Unexpectedly, Black Vin took his axe and struck a powerful blow, but no one saw where. The blow was so strong that dust rose around them, and the enemy army was forced to retreat. But to the surprise of Black Vin and Shinn, Shinn's knights began to attack the enemies. and when the enemies realized that it was an ambush, they began to report to Black Vin. Some of the enemy knights ran up to Black Vin and told him that they needed to leave the battlefield immediately. Black Vin quickly jumped on his horse, thinking that he would never forget the disgrace that Li Yushin had brought upon him. While Black Vin fled, his army tried to catch up with him, and everyone began to flee in panic. While the enemies fled, Shinn stood with his army and watched them without doing anything. Exhausted, Shinn fell to the ground, but the only thing that mattered to him at that moment was whether he would now be able to save Sepia. Suddenly, a female figure on horseback approached Shinn and asked if he was alive. Exhausted, Shinn could not see who it was, but because it was a female figure, Shinn thought it was Sepia. The light-haired girl on the horse shouted to the others to quickly prepare a stretcher because she had found a living boy. While Shinn was asleep, he had a strange dream. Long ago, a girl left the battlefield with her first tear. But in front of the girl was Shinn, and with her second tear, she left a ring as a promise to return. And as the years passed, the girl continued to wait for Li Yushin, tears falling from her eyes one after another. But as Shinn was leaving, the girl realized that he would never return to the battlefield, and the promise on the ring remained unfulfilled. Then someone called Li Yushin in his sleep, and when water splashed on him, he woke up. Shinn thought he had imagined someone calling him by a name he had almost forgotten, but to Shinn's surprise, he found himself in an unfamiliar place in some tower, bound by iron chains. Someone was shouting at Shinn to get up. Looking around, Shinn saw his knights and realized that he was not in the real world, but still in the game. Standing in front of Shinn was a girl with light hair who looked very familiar to him, and she asked if Shinn had come to his senses. An angry Shinn wondered why he was still in this game and couldn't get back. Shinn wondered why it wasn't over yet, even though he had managed to get through this hell. When Shinn started fighting on the chain, the knights wanted to get their swords, but the girl stopped them and told Shinn that he still didn't understand the situation he was in. Sitting down in a chair, the girl told Shinn in a commanding tone to tell her everything he knew. Shinn talked a lot while he was unconscious. Looking at the girl, Shinn recognized Maria, whom he had met in Elog, Korea, and asked if it was really her. Shinn wanted to destroy her. After Shinn's words, Maria was frightened, and when Shinn began to break free from the chains, she couldn't believe his strength, because these chains held the castle gates. Maria's knights were also frightened and drew their swords, ready to attack Shinn. But Shinn had already managed to destroy the chains that held him, and Shinn was filled with rage. Throwing aside the chains, Shinn knocked the knights to the ground, which frightened them greatly, and the knights called Shinn a monster. After striking Mary's knights, Shinn took one of their swords to use if anyone attacked him. Seeing Shinn strike her knights, Maria rose from her seat, not knowing what to do, and wondered who Li Yushin was. Suddenly, Shinn noticed Maria and grabbed her by the neck with one movement to lift her up, and Shinn told the girl that now he would ask her questions. Shinn said sternly that he remembered Maria, and that she was the same girl who was in the test room at the time. Shinn remembered Maria's conversation with director Lee Hyung-gu. Before starting the simulator, Shinn did not understand what Maria had said to Lee Hyung-gu, so Shinn told Maria that she should tell him everything she knew, because his patience was running out. Without saying anything, Maria thought Shinn was crazy, and she believed it would not be an exaggeration to say that Shinn was on the same level as Blackwell. Looking sternly at Shinn, the girl suspected that Shinn was third rank, but she guessed that Shinn knew nothing about this place. At that moment, Shinn wondered why no one wanted to listen to him. But Shinn told Maria that he was sure that if he had come to this world with her, then if he destroyed her, she would restart. Frightened, Maria asked Shinn what he was thinking, and at that moment, Shinn grabbed Maria's leg. Frightened, the girl screamed at Shinn not to do it because he wanted to hit her. Shinn looked sternly at Maria and said that everything would be fine with her after she rebooted, so she just had to endure it. At that moment, Shinn squeezed the hand that was holding Maria's leg, injuring her, and Maria screamed in pain. Maria's scream could be heard even on the castle street, attracting the attention of the knights who were there. Satisfied with Maria's reaction, Shinn smiled and said that now it was time for her other leg. Then Maria screamed that he shouldn't do it and that she would tell Shinn everything. Shinn was pleased with her answer. But Maria had one condition. In exchange for telling the truth, she asked Shinn to become her ally and help her in future battles, no matter what happened in the future. Grabbing Maria's other leg, Shinn asked if she really thought she was in a position to bargain with him. Shinn asked Maria maliciously why they were doing everything for this terrible game, and asked if she was really from the online game. Maria asked Shinn if he still believed that this was just a game, and declared that Shinn was wrong. Surprised, Shinn asked Maria what she was talking about and how this could not be a game. But Maria stood her ground and told Shinn to accept her condition first. Shinn agreed to Maria's condition and thought that he didn't care about anything except Sepia, so it didn't matter to him who he would fight for. When Maria heard Shinn's agreement, she told him to listen carefully and began her story that this was not just a game, but a simulator developed for military purposes. Shinn couldn't believe his ears as Maria continued to tell him everything she knew. Maria explained that, more specifically, it was all for the spark of power that Shinn himself was using in battle right now. Maria said that they also called it an energy development program. Shinn shouted angrily that she should stop telling lies, even if it was all for power and energy. For Shinn, it was still just an illusion inside a simulator. Maria continued talking to Shinn and explaining what was happening. Maria asked Shinn if there was a possibility that this power could work in the real world. In his mind, Shinn said that couldn't be true. Maria said that this simulator provides such an opportunity and that this is the real reason and purpose of reality. But remembering CEO Lee Hyung-gu and branch manager Bernard, Maria said that they were abusing this technology. Director Lee Han-gu and branch manager Bernard are training people in this simulator to see how they hold up. Maria recalled that there had been a tip about an illegal supplier, which is why she entered the simulator to investigate. Sheena was intrigued by Maria's words about the investigation. Maria said she shouldn't talk about it, but she had a stake in this real simulator. Shinn said maliciously that putting everything else aside, he wanted to know why he had been chosen for the simulator. Shinn said he had nothing to do with military tests or illegal deliveries. Shinn stated that he was just a regular high school student and he just wanted to play a realistic VR game. Maria then said that Lee Yu Shinn was just incredibly lucky and that he was just an ordinary guy who was chosen from among many other candidates for beta testing and sent to this hell himself. Then Shinn became angry and asked Maria maliciously if she really thought he would believe that. Out of anger, Shinn squeezed his hand around Maria's neck, and at that moment, the girl stopped talking. But after clearing her throat, Maria continued that even she did not know why he had been chosen. Looking at Shinn maliciously, Maria said that he could destroy her many times, but she would never answer his question of why they had chosen him. This angered Shinn, but there was some truth in Maria's words, and he understood her answer. But with a smile, Maria asked Shinn if he knew that despite everything, the simulator had its original settings. Shinn just listened to Maria telling him that right now, this simulator had truly turned into hell just to destroy one anomaly named Lee Yu Shinn. Looking sternly at Shinn, Maria said that he should remember what she had said. Remembering the branch manager Bernard and director Lee Hyung-gu, Maria said that they would even sell their souls to achieve their goal. Meanwhile, branch manager Bernard and director Lee were having a video conference. Branch manager Bernard told director Lee that he hoped his strategy for resolving the situation with Lee Yu Shinn would be successful. Director Lee replied to manager Bernard that he would not disappoint him, although he was very nervous about the whole situation with Shinn. When Bernard hung up, one of Director Lee's subordinates approached him and wanted to object. But Director Lee did not let his subordinate speak and, interrupting him, told him to be quiet and synchronize with his account by downloading the 9th protocol. Then Director Lee entered the simulator cabin and realized that if it came to that, Director Lee himself would destroy Lee Yu Shinn. Meanwhile, the knights from the castle heard a woman scream and ran inside to find out who was screaming, suspecting that he had escaped from prison. When the knights ran inside, they asked who was there. They were surprised when they saw General Shinn. But when they looked at General Shinn, the knights saw that Maria, whom Shinn had already released, was next to him. With smiles on their faces, the knights began to discuss how General Shinn was in prison with the princess. Then Shinn smiled, looking at Maria as if mocking her chosen status as a princess. This annoyed Maria, and she declared that this was her personality in this world, insulting Shinn. With a smile, one of the knights told General Shinn that everyone was looking for him. Surprised, Shinn asked why everyone was looking for him, and Maria also became interested. Meanwhile, Shinn's knights were out on the street, relaxing, laughing, and discussing something cheerfully. And when Shinn came out onto the tower, one of the knights immediately noticed him and told everyone, and the other knights began to search for him with their eyes. Raising their swords, the knights began to greet General Lee Yu Shinn, calling him the heir to the great general who defeated Black Vin's messenger of destruction. Annoyed, Maria behind Shinn said that he was like a local idol, while the knights loudly praised Shinn. But Shinn just looked down at his knights as if he was not pleased. Then Maria said she apologized for disturbing him, but she had something important to tell him, which caught Shinn's attention. Maria told Shinn that if he wanted to get out of this simulator, Black Vin was the final boss and had to be destroyed. Then, with an evil smile, Shinn said that from the moment he entered the simulator, he finally heard the answer he had been waiting and searching for so long. Remembering all the restarts, Shinn could no longer count how many times he had heard that he had to destroy Black Vin, and for Shinn it wasn't even funny. Meanwhile, someone was watching Shinn's castle and an unknown figure in a cloak approached the strange camp. Black Vin sat in one of the tents, sensing that someone had entered, and asked the stranger if he had come to repair his broken halberd. Black Vin called the stranger a sorcerer, and the sorcerer began to remove the hood of his cloak. Under the cloak was the sorcerer Lee Hengu, who told Black Vin that if he wished, he could make him a new and stronger halberd instead of repairing the old one. But the reason why the sorcerer Lee Hengu came to General Black Vin so late was that he wanted to deliver an order from the second prince. This plan was so ingenious that Black Vin could easily defeat Shinn. Black Vin was intrigued. The sorcerer Lee told Black Vin that he simply had to give permission for his soldiers to be in the vanguard in tomorrow's battle. And when Shinn fell asleep, he had another dream about the girl who had not returned, and many said that she had already been destroyed, although Shinn still felt her presence. Somewhere far away on the battlefield, Shinn believed that the girl was still alive and waiting for him. There, where knights fought each other, constantly shouting and exhausting their strength, the girl still went there only for the promise they made that day to be together with the owner of the ring who promised to return. Shinn didn't know if it was a dream or an illusion, but he was sure he had seen it before. But when the girl was destroyed in his dream, Shinn woke up in fear and screamed. This frightened those present, and Shinn was so scared that he jumped up and broke the table next to him. One of the nurses asked Shinn with concern if he was okay and if he was all right. Shinn didn't understand what had happened, but just looked at Sepia, who was still lying unconscious in the bed next to him. Shinn thought that in his dream, it seemed like the girl was right in front of him. Suddenly, Maria knocked on the door and called General Li Yu Shinn, saying that she knew he had matters of the heart. But Maria apologized for distracting him at such a moment, saying that unknown people had entered their territory that morning. This surprised Shinn, and unknown knights with huge spears gathered at their gate. Shinn's knights peeked out of the castle and said that they thought they would start the assault as soon as the sun rose, and wondered what they were doing. Surprised, Shinn and Maria also looked at the enemy army, and wondered if Black Vin was not going to attack, and wondered who these strange knights in front of his castle were. While the 9 knights stood in front of the enemy army, the enemy wondered why there were only 9 of them. Black Vin turned to the wizard Li and asked if he really thought that 9 knights would be enough to win this battle. Responding to General Black Vin, the wizard Li sat on his horse and told him that this was not the end. Smugly, the wizard Li Hengu said that he would definitely destroy Shinn for Black Vin. In his mind, Li Hengu thought that since he had come here in person, defeat was impossible. Using his magic, the wizard Li Hengu ordered his knights to begin the attack. Then the knights seemed to wake up and prepare for the attack, taking their swords and starting to move. But to the surprise of everyone present, they began to run in circles like a whirlwind, which was very strange. Shinn's knights did not understand what was happening and thought that their technique was similar to that of a dragon, and that the coming of a dragon was just a pompous phrase. Watching the strange knights and eavesdropping on the conversation of Shinn's knights, Maria was surprised and became interested in the dragon. And when the strange knights gathered their strength to create a strange dragon, they seemed to crash into Sheena's castle. When the strange knight struck the castle, it frightened Shinn's knights, causing some debris to hurt the other knights inside the castle. Then the frightened Maria realized that it was not a dragon but a hydra, which meant that each head was a living organism. Maria called the hydra a monster and saw that it was attacking again, so she ordered all her troops to return to the gates. Maria sternly announced to the knights that if the castle gates were destroyed, it would mean the end for all of them. Then Shinn's knights went to the gates to protect them from the hydra's attacks. Meanwhile, Shinn told Maria that it did not matter if there was one head or several, because Shinn was ready to destroy every one of them. And then Shinn deliberately destroyed part of the tower he was standing on so that he could climb down. No one expected such actions from Shinn, and they shouted to him to make sure the general was all right. Shinn flew down headfirst toward the enemy knights below. Frightened, Maria thought that the commander was rushing in without a plan, which was senseless, and shouted to Shinn, asking him what he was doing. But Shinn began to run along the castle wall before falling, and lunging forward, Shinn was ready to attack. And then Shinn began to strike the hydra and hit it to destroy it. But the strange enemy knights were ready for Shinn's attack and switched to defense mode. Although the enemy knights defended themselves, Shinn still managed to destroy them with ease. Black Vin and Maria, along with Shinn's knights, were surprised and opened their mouths in amazement. Shinn destroyed the strange knights with his sword and thought that this would be the end. Shinn's knights began to shout his name and raised their swords in his honor, rejoicing in his victory. But Maria was still frightened and continued to think about the hydra, knowing that from the beginning of the simulator, this hydra should not have existed. Maria realized that in order to destroy Li Yu Shinn, who had unexpectedly awakened, Li Hengu had specially added the hydra as an addition. Maria wondered what Li Yu Shinn had to go through. The bodies of the strange knights lay motionless, and Black Vin and his army just watched as Shinn defeated them. Unsatisfied, Black Vin asked the wizard Li Hyung-gu if this was why they had sent his knights to the vanguard. The wizard Li replied that this was only the beginning because his knights would get what they wanted so much, namely endless hellish suffering. Then Maria saw Li Hyung-gu and realized that he was the one behind the strange hydra. To Shinn's surprise, he saw that the bodies of the strange knights began to gather and rise. Smiling, Shinn joked that now he would have to fight zombies. Black Vin was also happy because he understood what was happening, and was glad that puppets that could not be broken had appeared, and he told the wizard Li that he had brought an interesting toy. And when the strange knights recovered, you could clearly see their lifeless faces. When Maria saw their faces, she recognized them and at first couldn't believe it. Maria screamed at Shinn not to fight, and thought that if her eyes weren't deceiving her, then it wouldn't matter how strong Shinn was. Maria shouted that Shinn would not be able to defeat them all in the end, but then Shinn had already started fighting. The smug wizard Li Hangu said that even if Shinn found out the truth, he would still be destroyed. But Shinn had no intention of giving up and looked straight into the strange knight's eyes, showing his determination. Then Shinn was attacked not only by one knight, but by 8 of his companions, whom Shinn tried to defend. But Shinn still managed to destroy the strange knights, although he was also wounded and found it difficult to fight. This surprised General Black Vin and his army but delighted Shinn's army. But no matter how many times Shinn destroyed the strange knights, they kept coming back, and in one of the battles, Shinn no longer had the strength to fight, so he lost. Then Shinn's 613th simulation restart ended. In a conversation with Maria, she told Shinn that these were not ordinary non-game characters, but the same ones Shinn had encountered before. Looking up at the sky, Shinn asked Maria who these strange knights were and where he had met them before. Maria explained that these were knights who could not be destroyed, and that there were terrible rumors about them among the Han River people. Maria had her doubts, but after she saw them, all her doubts disappeared. Looking at the strange knights, Maria said that she recognized them by their faces and explained that they were the long-lost genius knights, Arslan and Medich. There was also Voltek and the knight Gunther with him. Maria said that some time ago they had all disappeared unexpectedly and were considered geniuses of the sword. Maria shouted loudly to Shinn that she understood his strength and that he was a third-rank knight whose power could not be underestimated, but that he could not fight all of them at once. Exhaling calmly, Shinn asked Maria if he was unable to stop them, then who else could do it? Shinn's knights were eavesdropping on their conversation, and Maria wanted to argue with Shinn but didn't know what to say. Maria realized that she and the knights were frozen with fear. Maria began to get nervous and didn't know what to do. She thought it was all nonsense. Shinn simply turned away from Maria and, having resigned himself to his fate, was ready for battle. Lost in thought, Maria realized that even if it was irresponsible and very shameful, the only person she could rely on at the gates of hell was Li Yu Shinn. Looking at Shinn's back, Maria realized that she had to trust him. Then Maria handed Shinn the pendant and told him to take it with him into battle against the strange knights. Maria explained to Shinn that it was not an ordinary pendant and that she had kept it for 7 years to use in an emergency. It was called the Crystal of Terry. Surprised, Shinn asked Maria why she had decided to give him something so important. Maria replied that the Terry crystal had to be used in situations like this. After thinking about it, Maria said that this was a no-win situation, because if Shinn lost, she would have no chance of surviving. So she had no choice but to trust Shinn and risk everything she had. Shinn was surprised that Maria trusted him and was willing to entrust him with such a valuable artifact. In his thoughts, Shinn thought about how he was stuck in this place and that his only ally was Sepia, and he smiled, thinking that he was not alone. Taking Terry's pendant, Shinn went to the enemy knights, preparing for battle. The enemy knights were waiting for Shinn, and as soon as he descended from the castle, they began their attack. Holding Terry's pendant in his hand, Shinn clenched it, feeling the wave of power inside it, and the strong will of the pendant was different from his own. Maria, watching Shinn, realized that she was not as strong as he was, but Shinn was trying to survive in this hell. Fending off the attacks of the enemy knights, Shinn threw Terry's pendant upward as he approached them. As it approached, Terry's pendant fell to Shinn and the enemy knights, and Shinn shouted at them not to dare stand in his way. Then Terra's pendant shattered, releasing incredible power, and Black Vin and the wizard Li were surprised by the pace of events. Shinn's determination allowed him to destroy the enemy knights, and Terry's pendant artifact helped him greatly. And as he delivered the fatal blows, Shinn asked the enemy zombie knights if they could regenerate again. Surprised, the wizard Li thought that even his unrivaled masterpiece, which he had personally created, had been reduced to dust by Shinn. Meanwhile, Shinn stood with his sword raised, waiting for the strange zombie knights not to return. The evil wizard Li began to shout insults at Shinn and wonder how he dared to bring him to this. At that moment, the wizard Li Hengu had an idea for a new plan and rubbed his magic ring. Then the wizard Li moved to another location with the thought that he would definitely destroy Shinn. And then, in a flash, the wizard Li moved to the infirmary in Shinn's castle and devised a plan for revenge. Wizard Li stood next to Sepia's bed, who still couldn't even get up on her own. One of the nurses was frightened and asked the wizard Li who he was and what he was doing there, dropping the tray with the teapot. The wizard Li maliciously told the nurse that she was just an insect and not a game character, so she should stop interfering with him, and then the wizard Li began to cast a spell. Meanwhile, Shinn's knights began to congratulate Shinn on his victory and shout in his honor, rejoicing that he had destroyed the dragon. Breathing out happily, even Maria rejoiced at Shinn's victory and realized that even if Shinn had her pendant, Terry's abilities were incredible and she considered him a monster. But unexpectedly, Shinn turned toward a strange noise that came from the castle, which no one had expected. Then one of the knights came to Princess Maria and announced that something was happening in the castle infirmary. The knight reported that there had been an ambush in the castle infirmary. Upon hearing this, Shinn was frightened and immediately rushed to the infirmary, taking only Sepia with him. When Shinn, Maria, and their knights arrived at the scene, they were very surprised by what they saw. Director Li stood before them, but in the guise of a wizard, and he greeted Li Yu Shinn and Miss Maria, as he had not seen them for a long time. The wizard Li held Sepia in his arms and announced that he was taking her away. With an evil laugh, the wizard Li said that of course he couldn't promise that he would just take her and leave quietly. Then, out of rage and malice, Shinn wanted to destroy Li Hyunggu and began to shout his name. The angry Shinn quickly ran towards Sepia and Li Hyunggu, wanting to save the girl. But unfortunately, Shinn did not have time to do anything, because the wizard Li Hyunggu had already disappeared from their infirmary. Shinn began to get nervous and angry, asking himself various questions, such as what kind of knight master he was, and what kind of heir to the general's lineage he was. And Shinn began to blame himself, considering himself pathetic. Gritting his teeth, Li Yu Shinn said that Bastard couldn't even protect a person dear to him from being kidnapped right before his eyes. But Shinn couldn't forget Sepia. Surprised, Maria asked Shinn if this girl was really that important to him, which made Shinn angry at Maria. Maria continued to say that Sepia was so important to him that he would be willing to rush into the enemy camp, even if it meant risking everything he had and falling into a trap. Meanwhile, the wizard Li brought Sepia to a strange room and beat her to bring her to her senses. The evil wizard Li Hengu asked Sepia who she really was, and whether she was a hacker or just a crazy person. Exhausted, Sepia came to her senses and asked Li Honggu why he was so afraid, and whether he was afraid of the real-world authorities who were holding him. Nervously, the wizard Li did not understand how Sepia knew this, and how much she knew. But Sepia continued and asked if he was afraid of who would soon be here. Sepia's words enraged the wizard Li Honggu, and he began to yell at her that he wasn't afraid of anything. Li Honggu maliciously told Sepia that as soon as Li Yushin came to their camp to rescue her, Li Honggu would do everything in his power to destroy them both. While Li Honggu was hurting Sepia, he thought that there was only a little left before he would realize his 1000th reboot scenario, which no user had ever achieved. Therefore, Li Honggu was confident that if Shinn came to them, he would fall into a trap. Meanwhile, Li Yushin stood in the infirmary and talked to Maria, and she didn't care if it was a trap or not. In her mind, Maria didn't quite understand how important Sepia was to Shinn, that he was willing to fight for her. Maria sternly asked Shinn, knowing the answer, and Shinn would definitely go to the enemy camp for Sepia. Showing no emotion, Shinn returned to Maria and his knights, and suddenly one of the knights addressed Shinn. Passing Maria, one of the knights told Shinn that if this was his will, then they had a request. Shinn's knights stepped forward surrounding Maria and told Shinn that they asked permission to follow him into battle. The knights' words and their determination greatly surprised Shinn, and he understood that the knights were not lying to him. Looking away, Shinn warned the knights that their adventure and battle would most likely end in death, and Shinn asked the knights if they were ready for this. Shinn's knights said that first of all, they would have been destroyed long ago if Shinn had not been there. Suddenly, the knights began to shout, talking about their wives and children and mothers, and asked Shinn to tell them that they would fight to the last to return home. Shinn couldn't believe his ears that the knights who had previously wanted to betray him were now ready to fight to the end, because all this time Shinn had thought he was fighting alone. Shinn ignored all the knights because they weren't game characters, but they also had feelings. Maria confidently told Shinn that she knew the wizard Li better than anyone else, so she was sure that he was hiding in an abandoned warehouse. Maria told Shinn that while he was fighting his way through, she and his knights would distract the enemy, and then Shinn would rescue Sepia, and they would all escape as quickly as possible. Shinn couldn't believe that both the knights and Maria were ready to go with him to fight, and Maria had even already come up with a plan of action. In her mind, Maria did not understand when or why, but if Li Yushin disappeared right now, then everything would come to an end. And not just the castle, but everything. Then Shinn decided that they would all attack the enemies together and took off his cloak. Meanwhile, the enemy knights who were near Sepia were talking about whether General Shinn would come to rescue some sick girl. But Shinn was already on his way to the enemy camp, determined to fight with his army. Then the enemy knights on the towers spotted him and announced Shinn's arrival to their comrades. Black Vin decided to check on Sepia himself, and touching her sick face, he told her that today would be the last day she would see Li Yushin's heir. When Black Vin heard the alarm from the street, he joyfully realized that the time for battle had come and that Li Yushin had already arrived. Shinn's knights rushed forward and began their attack on the enemy knights as planned. While some enemy knights were preparing to attack Shinn's knights and shouting about it, one of the knights noticed some strange commotion. Meanwhile, Sepia fell into a dream in which a girl walking through a hellish forest of battle finally arrived. The girl walked a long way to the village, and although the streets were empty, she had no strength left to walk, so she fell down. A carriage drove by the girl and a young man reached out his hand to her, asking if she was all right. The girl did not quite understand where she was, but she knew that she had met the resident again. Looking at the boy, the girl recognized him as Li Yushin, who did not recognize her and asked who she was. But this young man, Li Yushin, could not even remember who he was. This made the girl cry. The enemy knights noticed that Sepia was crying in her sleep and began to mock her and ask her what had happened, and if she was crying because she was worried about Li Yushin. But at that moment, Li Yushin, the boy who couldn't remember anything, came forward and called out to Sepia. While Sepia was crying, she realized that Shinn couldn't remember her because he had forgotten her a long time ago. Returning to the past, General Li Yushin was in the middle of a battle in the Emperor's castle when, for some unknown reason, Shinn was summoned to the Queen, who announced to the young man that he was now the Lord of the castle. The young man Shinn was not ready to become the Lord of the Emperor's castle. The only thing waiting for Shinn in that castle was the Queen, who was considered a cold-hearted woman, and the Emperor's face was very similar to Shinn's. The cold-hearted Queen told Shinn that if he did not agree, the conditions would be different, and behind the woman stood a strange old woman. Remembering the girl Sepia, the Queen told Shinn that if he refused her conditions, the person he cherished most in the world would be destroyed in his place. Clarifying, the Queen asked Shinn what he would choose, surprising the boy. Shinn understood that this was something he could never refuse, and he was faced with a choice without a choice. Shinn confidently said that he would become the new emperor, but first he had one request. Shinn showed her the ring that hung around his neck on a string, and asked her to give it to the girl. Although Shinn understood that this was a truly sad farewell. Shinn began to cry and his grandmother approached him, stroked his head and told him not to be so sad. But the grandmother decided that if Shinn's memories disappeared, then his pain would disappear with them. With her hand, his grandmother began to cast a spell and decided to use her magic on Shinn. Shinn was surprised. He hadn't expected this, and after that he couldn't remember Sepia. That is why when Shinn met Sepia on the streets of the village, he did not recognize her and asked who she was, even though he was crying in front of her. And then Shinn was crowned emperor. Returning to the present, Shinn destroyed the knights who were protecting Sepia and broke the ropes that were holding her. Approaching, Shinn caught the sick Sepia, who was still not feeling very well. Shinn asked Sepia with concern if she was alright and if she was hurt anywhere. But Sepia did not answer, thinking that even if he did not remember her, it did not matter to her. Sepia considered herself a girl who had decided to protect Shinn from any danger. Although Shinn didn't remember her, Sepia always watched Shinn and looked at him from behind. After receiving her sword, Sepia began her difficult training to join Shinn's army in the future. One day when Shinn was in the castle with the queen, someone decided to visit them. It was Sepia, who had just become an imperial escort knight and was supposed to be with Shinn. When Shinn saw her, he smiled and was very happy to see Sepia. But time passed for them with endless days until they were attacked by a black beast named Black Vin, who destroyed everything in his path. And it was because of Black Vin that the former emperor was destroyed, even though he was considered very strong and compared to a god. When Shinn was wounded, Sepia cried beside him and did not know how to save him, because she understood that Shinn was in great pain. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange voice telling her not to cry, and Sepia began to look around. It was the old woman who had taken Shinn's memories, and she appeared before them as if out of thin air. The grandmother said that there was one more way to save Shinn. This news surprised Sepia, and the grandmother tapped her cane, creating a barrier that hid Shinn and Sepia. In a calm voice, the grandmother said that Shinn must start a new life in another world and began to move him. Sepia asked her grandmother if she could go to another dimension with Shinn, and her grandmother replied that she would give Sepia a chance. The old woman said that in the world where he would appear, when he was in danger, she would allow Sepia to protect him once, regardless of the world barrier. Hearing her grandmother's words, Sepia smiled quietly and felt relieved and thanked her grandmother. While Sepia was in Shinn's arms, the boy looked around to see if there was any danger. Sepia, meanwhile, smiled quietly because she was content with what she had. Meanwhile, in the real world, the grandmother and people in black suits arrived at the building where the simulator was located. The men in black suits disabled those who tried to stop them and stood in their way. After looking around the room and listening to her agents, the old woman said that he had done a lot of bad things. Branch manager Bernard tried to escape from the premises so as not to be caught by the agents in black. But suddenly behind him, Bernard heard the old woman shouting at him, so he turned around. Frightened, Bernard was surprised to see the fourth elder standing in front of him. But the old woman who was the fourth elder simply told him to get Bernard out of her sight. Shouting, branch manager Bernard said that he did not know what rumors had reached the elders, but first asked them to listen to him. But the old woman did not care that he was shouting and begging. The grandmother asked her agents where their little mouse, Li Yushin, was. One of the agents replied that, as the old woman had thought, Li Yushin was now in the simulator. And then the grandmother announced that they needed to hurry so that no one else would shed any more tears. Meanwhile, in the simulator, Shinn put his cloak on Sepia and said that it must be difficult for her to move, and that they should hurry because their comrades were waiting for them. Sepia looked back and noticed the raincoat because there was some red writing on it. With a smile, Sepia told Shinn that he finally had comrades in battle, and that she was very happy. Shinn looked at the cloak in surprise, realizing what Sepia was talking about, and agreed with her. Now he had an army. Shinn's knights had truly become his comrades, who believed in their general Shinn and would follow him to the end. Shinn resolutely lifted Sepia and announced that they would all return home together, and that Shinn would leave no one behind. Shinn shouted to his knights that they must return to the citadel as quickly as possible, and that everyone must hurry. Shinn's knights joyfully shouted that it was Shinn who must return alive. The knights' words surprised Shinn, and they added that Shinn should return home. Then the enemy knights attacked Shinn's knights, shattering Shinn's thoughts of taking everyone home. General Black Vin's enemy knights did not touch Princess Maria, who was standing in their midst. The wizard Li appeared with a laugh and asked Shinn and Princess Maria if they had really called their pitiful knights a diversion. Turning around, Princess Maria saw Li Hengu and began to get angry at his words. General Black Vin, who was called the Black Beast, also appeared on the battlefield. Blackwin found Shinn and Sepia again, who were standing in each other's arms in front of him. Blackwin sternly told Shinn that if he had not come to their camp, he might have survived the night. Standing before Shinn on his horse among his destroyed knights, Blackvin said that it was pitiful. Looking back, Maria also saw Blackwin and called him the Black Beast. Looking at Blackwin, Maria thought that the reason he was called the Lion of Nemea was not only because of his incredible strength, but also because of his ingenuity. Turning away from Black Vin, Maria looked at Shinn, worried about him. Looking at Shinn, Maria realized that he had used all his strength in the battle with the Hydra, so he was tired, but holding on to his stubbornness. Black Vin's words about his companions being destroyed because of Shinn were aimed at his mental state, because Black Vin deliberately wanted to crush Shinn psychologically. While Shinn was still holding Sepia, Black Vin began to approach them on horseback. In her mind, Maria understood that if Black Vin and Shinn started fighting now, Shinn's chances of winning were very slim. While Shinn was thinking about what to do, Sepia, who was standing nearby, asked Shinn if the lives of his fellow knights mattered. This surprised Shinn, and Sepia tried to stand up to speak more clearly to Shinn. Looking at Shinn, Sepia asked if it didn't matter what the knights wanted to get through Shinn. Gritting his teeth, Shinn replied to Sepia that anything was possible, and recalled how the knights had simply asked Shinn to tell the people who were important to them that they had fought to the end and were heroes. Sepia told Shinn that if he felt burdened by this, she would help him. With her hand, Sepia took Shinn's sword by the blade, which frightened Shinn, and he asked her what she was doing. After writing her name on Shinn's sword, Sepia said that she was doing what she wanted and returned Shinn's cloak, on which the names of all his knights were written, saying that she would not be a burden to him. Putting Shinn's cloak on him, Sepia said that she would be his wings and help him. Meanwhile, Maria just stared silently at Shinn and Sepia and thought that this might be the end for them, and wondered how Sepia could remain so calm at a moment like this. But Maria was curious about what Shinn would do. Looking into Sepia's eyes, Shinn wondered why she said wings and not a burden. Sepia looked into Shinn's eyes without saying anything, simply hinting for him to look behind him. Then Shinn noticed that the names of the knights who had fought him were written on his cloak. With a smile, Shinn understood and said that it turned out his comrades were still there. Shinn's smile surprised Black Vin and began to annoy him because his trick had not worked. Sepia put her hand on Shinn's cheek, which surprised him, and she wanted to tell him something. Smiling slightly, Sepia told Shinn that from now on he should catch the wind and fly. And in her thoughts, Sepia called Shinn a person dear to her. Then Sepia suddenly fell down because she still couldn't heal herself, which frightened Shinn, and he came closer to her again. Shinn asked Sepia not to say anything more because he understood her completely. Leaving Sepia to rest, Shinn took his sword and was ready to fight Black Vin. Shinn analyzed that he was going into battle without any plan or strategy, but would simply charge at Black Vin. Black Vin did not expect such a turn of events and even began to feel nervous in front of Shinn, sensing his determination. Black Vin looked at Shinn, who was calmly walking towards him, and realized that he had no plan or fear, and even Black Vin could not sense Terra's artifacts. This began to annoy Black Vin, and he tried to calm himself with the thought that it was useless, and that Shinn was still alone, so he would defeat him. While Shinn calmly approached Black Vin, he tried to calm himself with the thought that he would destroy Shinn and that this tiresome war would also come to an end. Black Vin maliciously took out his huge axe and was ready to strike Shinn. Then the wizard Lee Hangu was already happily thinking about how Black Vin would defeat Shinn, and he would achieve his goal. Meanwhile, in the real world, agents in black were killing people who stood in their way and were involved in crimes related to Shinn and did not want to give themselves up. The agents in black announced that from that moment on, access to all simulators for Korea would be revoked. While some of Lee Hyung-goo's employees stood with their hands up, the agents announced that everyone in the control room would be detained until a disciplinary decision was made. The fourth elder asked his subordinates who had taken control of the simulator what was happening with it. Then one of the agents said that unfortunately, the situation that the grandmother had been worried about had happened. Sadly, the old woman accepted what had happened to Shinn and thought that these children had a very cruel fate, and she wondered why this was so. Sepia mysteriously watched Shinn and seemed to be praying for his victory over Black Vin. But Shinn was not afraid of Black Vin at all and was not afraid of losing, and he could calmly look Black Vin in the eyes. This surprised Black Vin, and he was amazed that Shinn could still fend off his attacks. Nervously, the wizard Lee Han-gu did not understand how Shinn could still fight, and how it had come to this. Surprised, Maria wondered how even a third-level master like Shinn could block Black Vin's strongest attacks. While Lee Yu-shin blocked the attacks, Maria wondered who he was and where he got such strength. But meanwhile, Shinn himself was surprised that he had the strength to repel Black Vin's most powerful blows and that he did not feel the blows or the weight of the sword. Shinn felt strange and unfamiliar sensations, and the angry Black Vin began to yell at Shinn, asking what kind of show he had decided to put on. But Shinn did not care what Black Vin was shouting at him because he continued to fight. With one blow, Shinn knocked Black Vin off his feet and threw him aside to put him in his place. Black Vin shouted viciously at Shinn that he shouldn't hold back and that it was time for Shinn to use his power. Black Vin flew at Shinn again to strike him, but Shinn was able to dodge her. Overcome with rage, Black Vin shouted at Shinn to use all his strength. The angry Black Vin continued to strike Shinn because he was determined to destroy him. Black Vin's blows were incredibly powerful, and Black Vin shouted that he wanted the ground beneath their feet to shake. And Black Vin shouted at Shinn to attack, but in his mind he was nervous and did not understand what was happening to him because he could not even scratch Shinn's clothes. Approaching Black Vin in a calm tone, Shinn asked him what the hell was going on. This was unexpected for Black Vin because Shinn had quickly switched from defense to attack. Shinn resolutely struck Black Vin and wondered in a calm voice why Black Vin thought that Shinn was using Terra. To the surprise of everyone around him, Black Vin could not even hurt Shinn, who continued to strike him. Moving even closer to Black Vin, Shinn calmly asked him if Terra was the power with which the Dark Vein destroyed and defeated all enemies. Black Vin, already panicking, viciously tried to deliver another powerful blow to Shinn. But Shinn deftly dodged and told Black Vin that if that was not the case, then it did not matter to him. And then Shinn decided to attack Black Vin on his own, concentrating on his attacks. Calmly, Shinn asked Black Vin if he had the same feeling that appeared in his subconscious when he was fighting an enemy. But Black Vin did not answer Shinn, and Shinn struck him with such force that he surprised all the enemy knights and Maria. Surprised, Maria wondered what was happening to Shinn, but Maria understood that if Shinn crossed the line, he would not be able to return. But Shinn just kept fighting calmly, not looking at anything because it was his duty. The frightened wizard Lee shouted to General Black Vin to get up immediately. In his mind, the wizard understood that even if this was only a copy of Black Vin, how could he lose this battle so easily, and he wanted Black Vin to get up immediately. Filled with rage, Black Vin understood that he had to defeat Shinn no matter what. General Black Vin wondered why he was unable to defeat Shinn, and thought that Shinn was just a little boy. Then Shinn raised his hand and began to release his power, telling Black Vin that no soldier or knight could even imagine the power they wielded, let alone fight against it. Black Vin asked Shinn what he was talking about, and Shinn replied that the power had destructive force, and was capable of wiping out everything in its path. Pointing to his cloak, Shinn said that they had given their lives and hands to Shinn, and had not kept their promises to their families that they would return soon. In his thoughts, Shinn remembered his knights, who despite their initial distrust, had trusted him and were destroyed for his sake. Remembering the determination of his knights, Shinn replied that it was this power that sustained him. Raising his sword, Shinn said that now he did not care what this terror that Black Vin was talking about was. Shinn declared that he would destroy Black Vin and return home. Remembering everyone, Shinn understood that this was the only thing he could do for them all. Shinn looked resolutely at the weary Black Vin. The spirits of the night stood behind Shinn and he felt them beside him, so he began to approach Black Vin in order to return. But at that moment, Black Vin struck the ground with his huge axe and began to release his unknown power. Shinn did not expect this and could not get close to Black Vin because of the strange pair. Blackhaven screamed at the top of his lungs like a wild beast as the power left him. This power was a unique ability that Black Vin possessed, and it was called Enhanced Explosive Power. Then Black Vin shouted to Shinn that they would go together to their destruction, and no one would return home. What was happening to Black Vin surprised everyone present in the game, as well as the agents watching the battle in the real world. The agents turned to the Fourth Elder and said that they needed to stop the simulator at any cost. The old woman told the agents not to do anything, and not to stop the simulator because if they intervened right now, when the entire system was already overloaded, they would most likely endanger Li Yushin's life. With regret, the Fourth Elder told the agents that there was only one thing they could do at the moment, and that was to simply watch the battle. Looking at Shinn's body in the real world, the grandmother thought that she hoped Shinn would get out of this hell on his own. Meanwhile, Shinn was surrounded by a bonfire that Black Vin had created with his strange powers. Princess Maria was also engulfed in flames and called out to Li Yushin. Not understanding where Black Vin got such power, Shinn tried to move, but he couldn't. In the center of this ball of fire stood Black Vin, smiling eerily and looking at Shinn, saying that he would put an end to everything. But there was one whom the fire did not touch, and that was the wizard Lee, who was very pleased with the situation. The wizard Lee thought with satisfaction that when Shinn was destroyed, everything would end, and the wizard Lee would reset the timer. Lee Hyung-gu hoped that everything would burn to ashes in this cruel fire. Wizard Lee Hyung-gu touched his ring to perform certain actions, and Shinn's body in the real world began to tremble. But suddenly Shinn began to speak in the real world, although he was still in the game. Then Shinn's 756 simulator restart began, and Shinn asked if they really thought this would end everything. Shinn was determined, and no matter how many times he was destroyed, even though he had to start over every time, he was ready to fight. Shinn's restarts continued for seconds, reaching the 989th restart. Shinn said resolutely that there was something inside him that no one present could take away, something that would not burn in any fire, and that was the wings entrusted to him by his warriors in Sepia. The grandmother's agents couldn't take their eyes off the screens and wondered what was going on. At that moment, Shinn began his 1000th reboot and took on a completely different appearance that surprised everyone. Shinn really did grow wings that seemed to be created from an incredible power that no one had ever seen before. When one of the agents saw this, he was surprised and realized that Li Yushin had become the 8th apostle. While the enemy knights simply fled the battlefield, the grandmother who was watching everything sadly said that in the end, Li Yushin had gone through this, and she felt sorry for him. While Li Yushin flew resolutely toward Black Vin, Maria tried to stop him, shouting that if Shinn went any further, he would never be able to return home. But Li Yushin couldn't be stopped, so he headed straight for Black Vin into the middle of the fire. At that moment, the wizard's ring that had been helping him broke, and he was terrified and shouted that this couldn't be happening. Turning around, Li Hengu shouted that some schoolboy had ruined everything, and on top of that, had become the 8th apostle. With tears in his eyes, Li Hengu couldn't believe it. Out of malice, Li Hyung-gu began to yell and scold the schoolboy Li Yushin. Meanwhile, in the real world, Li Yushin's capsule broke due to his new abilities. In the real world, Li Yushin got to his feet but did not stand on the ground. Now he had the ability to fly. However, Li Yushin's consciousness was still in the simulator, but he was also flying in the game. Shinn stood very close to Black Vin, not looking at the fire he was shooting, and then Shinn told Black Vin that their battle was over and it was time to say goodbye. With these words, Shinn delivered the final fatal blow to Black Vin, achieving his goal and finally defeating the boss. Shinn's blow to Black Vin was so incredibly bright that it blinded the enemy knights and Princess Maria. For Lee Hyung-gu, this was the worst thing that could have happened, and he began to panic and shout that he shouldn't have entered the simulator at all, and that he needed to get out of the game immediately no matter what it took. Suddenly, an unknown figure appeared behind Lee Hyung-gu and told him not to even dream about it. It was the fourth elder, and she told Lee Hyung-gu that he had no right to do so. Frightened, Lee Hyung-gu did not expect to see the elder here and began to ask how she even got into the simulator. Lee Hyung-gu began to justify himself to the fourth elder, shouting that if she believed the false rumors, then it was all an order from his superiors. But the old woman did not even listen to Lee Hyung-gu's excuses and, placing her finger on his forehead, told him to shut up because she did not speak the language of rats. And then the old woman destroyed Lee Hyung-gu both in the simulator and in the real world. Meanwhile, Maria waited for the bright light to disappear and began to search for Lee Yushin with her eyes. Lee Yushin stood alone in the middle of the battlefield, his powers swirling around him, and Maria was happy that he was alive, but she understood that it might only be temporary. Behind Maria, her grandmother appeared and said that Shinn's body might not hold out much longer. Maria did not expect to see her grandmother here, so she was frightened. Maria cried out to her grandmother to save Lee Yushin because Shinn was still in his 1000th reboot, so it was possible for her. Maria begged the elder to do something, but her grandmother only looked at Maria with pity. The grandmother stroked Maria's head and said that if Maria sincerely wanted to protect someone, she should become stronger and not cry like Sepia. Then Maria looked back and saw Sepia walking toward Shinn, who seemed frozen in place. The grandmother said that even though Sepia's body was damaged, she was still moving resolutely toward Lee Yushin. Shinn felt as if he had entered another reality and sensed someone walking straight toward him. Shinn found himself in a wheat field at sunset, and Sepia was walking resolutely toward him. In this place familiar to Shinn, he met the one who had always been waiting for him, and it was the girl with Sepia's ring. Shinn was very happy to see her and told Sepia with a smile that he had returned to her. Shinn looked at Sepia with joyful eyes, although in reality, the destructive force that had wronged them both was still swirling around him. But Sepia didn't care, and she had waited so long to hear those words from Shinn that she reached out to embrace him. Throwing away his sword, Shinn fell into Sepia's arms, losing the last of his strength. When Shinn fell into Sepia's arms, she felt him growing weaker. And then Sepia cried out that she wanted to protect Shinn again, and she addressed these words to her grandmother. Looking sadly at Shinn and Sepia, the grandmother asked her if she understood that every miracle has its price. Sepia replied resolutely that no matter what it cost her, she wanted Lee Yushin to live. And if Shinn's destruction was cancelled, then it would be necessary to erase all his memories related to this place. The grandmother emphasized that she would take away Shinn's memories of Sepia. Sepia knew this because it had happened before, but she told her grandmother that she agreed to these conditions. Standing nearby, Maria couldn't believe what was happening and just watched everyone. Grandmother understood Sepia's desire, and approaching Shinn began to cast a spell on him, while asking Sepia not to cry. At that moment, the simulator's work was complete, and the battle ended with Lee Yushin's victory. Lee Yushin woke up in the hospital while snow was falling outside, and Lee Yushin had already been in the hospital for a month. When the holidays ended, Lee Yushin was on his way home when he got into an accident, and it was also snowing that day. Shinn's parents and the doctor said that Shinn had been in a coma for a month, so he had no memory of that time. But Shinn was surprised by the physical condition of his body because he had strange calluses and a toned, muscular body. Suddenly, Shinn saw a girl outside the window whose name he did not remember, but she seemed very important and familiar to him. It was Sepia. Seeing her, Shinn thought that maybe he was being lied to and that he needed this girl. Getting up, Shinn ran out into the street to catch up with the girl standing there. But Sepia headed for the car that was waiting for her near the hospital because it was time to go. While Shinn ran out of the hospital, the car with Sepia had already left without waiting for him. Shinn could only watch in disappointment as the car drove away with Sepia. In the car, the elder asked Sepia if she was sure she didn't want to talk to Lee Yushin and say goodbye because she would never see him again. But Sepia replied that they would meet again someday and that her grandmother shouldn't worry about it. Sepia said that they had promised each other to meet again, and Shinn noticed the ring that Sepia had left for him. Remembering the moment when Shinn was with Sepia in the wheat field, he told her that he would always be her knight in shining armor. Sepia smiled back at Shinn and was very happy to hear his words. Shinn and Sepia stood facing each other in the field at sunset, their hair blowing in the wind. Shinn was sure that he knew the girl in front of him, and he knew that they would definitely meet again in the future.